Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN WhatIf 2.0, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Took a Bite Out of Villainy? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. If you really want a quirk so bad, take a swan dive off the roof and hope you'll get one in the next life. The words reverted around in the capsule that was Izuku's head. They bounced off the surfaces of his skull, lingering in his brain and only growing more numerous by the second. Why was he thinking so much of the benefits behind that offer? Why were there benefits behind that offer? Why was he actually listening to Katsuki, of all people? Want a quirk? Swan dive off the roof. Get one in the next life. Sure, they've cavilled over the span of almost a decade now, but never had he been given the suggestion of killing himself. Stupid Kaken, he'd be committing suicide if he did that. Even if he didn't die on impact, it still would have hurt like hell to even comprehend the pain. A slow death, perhaps? Why was he thinking about the possibilities of jumping off the roof? This is his fault. He's the only reason that the poor boy was considering death right now. But he wouldn't say that aloud. He couldn't. Once upon a time, he wanted to expiate with his childhood friend, wanted to mend the shattered and mauled relationship they obtained now, wanted to be seen as an equal. Apparently that, too, was a loose dream. Izuku had already made his way out of the classroom as soon as he was sure Katsuki wasn't there anymore. He didn't want to see the male right now. He didn't want to see Katsuki ever again, really. This'll be the last time he's a victim to the male's behavior. He'll rest for a while to get over it. He wrung his fingers around the damp notebook floating aimlessly in the koi pond. The fish circled the ripples of the object when it was plucked from their environment. Probably because they thought it was food, Izuku attempted to muse, but his mind continued to plague him with images of how others might react to his own death. His mother would be the only one to attend the funeral, he supposed as he wrung out the volume 13 notebook he created. He allowed a small sigh to rack his body. His mother was as stressed as she was. Maybe not having a child to feed every day and worry about whenever he came home with scorch marks all over his limbs would decrease that stress? Yeah, it would. It really would. Inko deserves the best, doesn't she? His mother is a good woman, no doubt about it. Izuku only wants her to be happy. Her husband was abroad, but still sending money to make sure his family could stand on their feet at all times. So he was a good man. Izuku only remembers his father's face from when he was around at the age of 2, but that's not his concern anymore. His new concern is simple, really. How am I supposed to take a jump from the roof without facing the prolonged writhing pain of it? He questioned himself aloud, clutching the slightly less damp notebook to his chest. His uniform was getting soaked from the excess water, but he was going to die anyways. It wouldn't matter, he presumed as he wandered back inside of the school. It was already time for everyone to go home, luckily for him, so the halls were completely empty. No teachers seemed to linger around either, so that was a plus. He didn't need anyone telling him to go home or stop whatever the hell they thought he was going to do. He was simply taking his friend's advice. What's so wrong with that? Nothing, his mind crooned, agreeing with his newly developed goal. Izuku's mind was far too clouded to come up with a reasoning to stay alive. It only supplied him with a reasoning to kill himself. It only got worse when he merely accepted the reasons wholeheartedly. His mother would have less weight to carry, Katsuki would be happy to be rid of this quirkless loser, and everyone's lives would be easier. Yeah, everyone would be happier without him, he reckoned as he mechanically trudged up the stairs leading to the rooftop. His eyes lidded themselves after a while, revealing an emotion that he typically never wore. A deep, glistening pool of repression twirled aimlessly in his irises. Said irises had also managed to darken over the years of bullying, making him practically seem like his quirk had something to do with the undead. Maybe he'd get a cool quirk like that in the next life. A smile that didn't even near his eyes formed on his face, gradually getting closer to his eyes the farther up the stairwell he went. He was, for once in his life, filled with absolute glee. Katsuki actually gave him some good advice. How charming, he cooed internally as he repressed a giggle from his own happiness. It didn't take a long time to reach the roof. A wind blew by, calming Izuku but only enhancing his overall glee. He had never upped so high before. It was thrilling. Is this what All Might felt like when he was jumping through the sky? Izuku practically scampered towards the railings and peered down, roughly a 3-story drop. He calculated as he hopped over the railings to stand on the very ledge. He then crouched down to sit casually, tore out a piece of paper from his hero notebook, and fished out a black marker. Sorry to anyone who cared. I just hoped the disappearance of my own body might make this world a better place. Besides, I can't be a hero. A useless Deku can't do anything right, huh? So I'm following Ka-si-si-han's advice. Maybe I'll get a cool quirk in another life. All I can be is hopeful, if not a little guilty for my mother. Mom, I'm sorry, but I can't do this anymore. I want to be a hero, and if killing myself allows me to do that, then I'll gladly do it. Ka-si-si-ichin wouldn't lie to me about getting a quirk in the next life, right Katsuki? Izuku Midoriya. He threw the marker aside and allowed it to fall to the ground below, humming in interest when it merely landed on the ground with a faint snap. He saw how it practically snapped in half, the top splatting its insides across the pavement below and leaving a long black streak in its wake. That'd be him soon, he trilled mentally in excitement. He was going insane now, but he didn't care. The sweet release of death would give him a quirk in another life, just like Katsuki said. Even though Katsuki is a good-for-nothing JRK, he never lies. Not wanting to waste another moment or get caught by someone who'd probably call the police or something, he tugged off his red sneakers. Once they were off, he put them on the other side of the railings he had leaned back against, soon reaching for the suicide note he managed to come up with on a whim. Izuku had purposely left his old friend's name in a more crude handwriting, spacing it out and even abandoning his little nickname of admiration. Can't admire someone you'll never see again, he reasoned somewhat darkly with a growing smile. He shouldn't be happy about this, but he is. The green-haired male peered lifelessly at the setup before turning to face the ground again. With a sigh, he propped himself up with the railing and glared at the ground. This is harder than he thought, looking down at the ground now. He inhaled before brainstorming how to properly jump without getting scared. Izuku perked up before imagining it was someone with a quirk to give him. Not out of pity, but out of the reasoning/thought that he could do something. His eyes widened gradually at the thought, his mind immediately supplying an image of someone practically handing him a free quirk. One that he could use freely to bring smiles to everyone's face and keep everyone he loved safe. Izuku swore he never jumped off something that high so quickly. He even thought he heard someone yell something, but he had lost consciousness whilst falling. He'd be able to rest at last. Wouldn't he? Alas, someone is always dwelling about to see a suicide. No matter how foolproof the plan seems, someone is always there. This someone just so happened to be Katsuki, of all people. The blonde has been on his way home when he realized that he had left his own possessions at the school, already looking forward to see if that dim and nerd Deku was still hanging around so he could vent his anger out physically on the poor thing. He marched there in an all-too-orderly fashion, cracking his knuckles absent-mindedly as he walked. Sure, Deku's obviously a pretty nice person, but his eagerness to get into an academy for future pro-heroes, to be exact, really set Bakugo off. He was the only one going to you today, and God forbid that Demon Nerd get in his way of becoming #1 and surpassing All Might. A crude grin slithered onto the male's face at the outline of someone sitting on the ledge of the rooftop. They seemed to be scribbling away at a notebook, which dripped fat drops of water to the ground with barely audible splashes. Of course the effing idiot would be sitting in a place he thought he'd be safe in, Bakugo comprehended as he readied himself to yell at the male. That is, until he stood up, removed his shoes. Oh my god, he's going to jump. Bakugo panicked. So, like anyone else would do, he ran. He's not going to catch him, is he? No, of course he's not. You. Here's the beginning of something nobody wanted, but everyone got. Just because of a simple misunderstanding. If you'd call telling someone who's obviously breaking inside to commit suicide via jumping off a high platform a misunderstanding, that is. So, in hindsight, Midoriya was crashing to the ground. Unless Katsuki found it valuable to use his quirk to propel himself forward and catch the male, which was highly illegal without the needed license to do so, one would scold if he were to be found out, The green-haired boy would be reduced to a mere mush on the pavement with broken bones and probably a steadily decreasing pulse. So, like the idiot Katsuki was, he didn't use his quirk. Katsuki had always been an idiot, no matter how high his test scores were or how witty his remarks were or how superior he was to everyone else in his cohort because of his intelligence. He'd always be an idiot because he always chose the wrong words and never knew how to properly depict his feelings without hurting someone. This is one of the many results. What gave him the right to use it on those without something deemed useful, if he wouldn't use it to save someone's life? He only ran towards where he assumed Izuku would land, which was a little in front of the koi pond. That's where he threw his notebook, Bakugo recited, feeling guilt claw at him at a time too late. You the idiot. You could have stayed as Izuku's friend and none of this shit would have happened in the first place. You're the FING Deku, not him. Why the hell was the nerd actually listening to him? All those other threats had been brushed off without any real concern, so why did this one tilt him off the edge? In a literal sense, too, but now was not the time to amuse himself with jokes. Deku, I swear to God, he snarled with no real malice, still charging as Izuku continued to fall. It was quite amazing how fast he was falling at this rate. From his own experience with lifting the boy, Izuku was quite light and barely weighed anything. An ant could pick him up if need be. Why the hell did you listen to me? He screeched at the falling body. Of course, there was no reply. Izuku had probably fallen into shock whilst falling against the current, Bakugo realized as he cursed and drove himself forward, trying to ignore to burning in his calves at how long he had been sprinting. A pair of lies. Izuku is actually decently heavy for his looks, and an ant would crumble beneath anything larger than a full-blown leaf. Bakugo should really stop degrading this poor boy. Bakugo became painfully aware of the fact that Midoriya would hit the ground before he could get to him. The burning in his calves also screamed at him to stop in unison with that thought. His body seemed to grow tired, as he had been a decent distance away to sight the outline of the all-too-familiar boy. Bakugo slowly stalled in his long strides, soon coming to a complete halt when Izuku was mere inches from the ground. Instead, he inhaled deeply, shut his eyes, clenched his fists, and prepared himself to hear the cracking of his childhood friend's bones and smell the scent of copper. A low grunt was all he heard. He immediately opened his eyes at the sound, knowing that Deku, his Deku, wouldn't be able to make a noise that deep. And he was right. Instead of Izuku's splayed body coated in his own blood, he saw something that leaned on borderline nightmare fuel rather than sickening. Possibly a vague mixture of both. A unique yet repulsive-looking in Katsuki's eyes creature, a monster, if you insist, with an oddly smooth-looking head, a stocky neck shrouded with thick, dark green fur, for complex yellow-green eyes that seemed to only focus in on the boy in its arms, a small slashed nostril, drooping ears and a rather long nose-like appendage upon their face like a marlin, kind of, but more terrifying stood in the place Bakugo should have stood. It cradled Izuku's limp body delicately, leaving Bakugo to merely look over the grotesque features of whatever the hell was holding his friend. He's not your friend anymore, a rational voice crooned from the back of his head, but he ignored it. He could continue to lie to himself for a bit longer, he supposed. It had visibly obvious broad shoulders, a protruding ribcage. It looked like it hadn't eaten anything, but it wasn't eyeing Izuku as if he was a snack, which made Bakugo slouch a tad in relief, a wasp-like waist, and a flat stomach. It had 4 moderately long, powerful-looking arms that ended in 7-fingered hands. Not 5, 7. What the F? What in all might's name is this thing? It had a sleek tail that could only be compared to that of a lion's protruding from its rear, elongated, yet all might-like legs that were bent like a dog's, and 2 forward-facing hooks that dangled from their agape jaw. They looked like sabers. Katsuki shuddered as he slowly approached the behemoth holding Midoriya. The abomination's body was covered in an exoskeleton, while its chest was covered in a tough hide with a few patches of fur blossoming. Its forearms, nose and forehead were a sickeningly aesthetic pastel green, while the rest of its body was a contrasting batch of metallic gray and light brown shadings. It looked terrifying all in all. Bakugo attempted to swallow down any nervousness that managed to blossom, for it slowly drained his terrified thoughts of what would happen to the falling figure of Izuku and replaced them with what would happen to him. Unfortunately for him, The anxiety lingered to introduce the many ways the creature would kill him or Izuku. However, the creature seemed to handle Izuku with the utmost care. It was almost like looking at a woman holding their newborn baby for the first time. Bakugo swallowed down a small mock jiji. It forged itself into a habit to pretend to jiji whenever someone brought up something mushy, and it really wasn't helping his case today as to not alert the oblivious creature of his presence. Said creature remained unaware of Katsuki's approaching form, swiveling their tail back and forth as they seemingly inspected Izuku with their beady eyes. Two of the eyes then partially retracted into their sockets, thus causing Bakugo to let out a choked jiji before slamming his hands over his mouth. He never fared well with things like body horror, leading to him attempting to get over his little fear via using Izuku as a punching bag. Obviously it didn't work, since Izuku never pulled his eyes deep into his sockets halfway to hide them. Nor was the boy a hulking mass of muscle and, holy shit, that's terrifying. The creature's head did a full 90-degree turn on him, and Bakugo could have sworn he heard a crack as it clutched Izuku closer to the unkempt-looking furs protruding from their hide-cloaked chest via two of its arms. The boy really wasn't conscious. And at this time? Great. Izuku would have probably passed out by n. Not the time, not the place. I have no effing right to ridicule him right now. Bakugo scolded himself. The eyes that had hidden themselves beneath the skin and wrinkles of the monstrosity's face rolled out from their sheaths abruptly when it fully faced him, causing Bakugo to swallow a bile that greeted him in the crest of his throat. The creature's maw upturned a little before falling back to a neutral grimace, their long tusks keeping their lips. Could he even call them lips? It just looked like a black outline from properly touching fully. Bakugo, slowly and cautiously, took a step towards the alerted creature. Wrong move. It landed on its remaining four limbs. Two of the six wrapped around Izuku more forcefully in a cocoon-like fashion, shielding him from Katsuki's view, and slowly opened his maw, revealing hundreds of jagged teeth rising from their dark pink gums. If that hadn't pushed Katsuki into a temporary espimson, then the screech that followed did. It was shrill and high-pitched, rattling whatever glass was within a 1-meter radius and even breaking a decent lot of said glass items. Bakugo silently prayed that there was nobody with a mutation quirk that made their body glass within said radius, or else he'd have a little more guilt on his shoulders. He clutched his ears, gritting his teeth and attempting to keep his eyes focused on the slowly blurring figure that held Deku. His head hurt, but he'd be dead if he let this thing run off with his friend. The thing's tail lashed back and forth. The motion taunted Bakugo, and it took a decent lot of willpower to keep himself from focusing on the added movement. The screech soon began to dim down, allowing the boy to remove his hands from his ears, smack the sound back into them. He had gone a little deaf from the shrillness of the screech, and glare at the kidnapper. For F's sake, he immediately lunged at the creature with a hand outstretched, but was stopped by the creature's icy gaze. It then grabbed him by the shoulder and meekly tossed him back to his place, leaving him crippled for a moment. It had squeezed his wrist with its claws, digging them into the skin in a teasingly slow manner, before pummeling him into the pavement, rewarding him with a painful-sounding snap within his spinal area. He broke something near his back, but the adrenaline nullified it to the best of its abilities. "Oi, get the F back here, Dash!" He attempted to yell, but his voice cracked a little near the end, thus leading to him trailing off abruptly. He had managed to drag himself off of the ground, but it had all been in vain. The creature had already sprinted off into the thickets of the nearby woodland area, soon disappearing among the overgrowth and trees thanks to its pelt. A thick substance coated the pavement, taking on a dark crimson mixed with blotches of red and small lumps. "It's not Deku's blood and flesh. It can't be," Bakugo tried to reassure himself, but to no avail. A mocking laughter resounded from the forest soon afterwards, a few birds taking flight in the distance at the unsettling noise. Bakugo merely looked after the creature, his shoulders now hunched as he began to drown in regret and, unsurprisingly, sorrow. His pride faltered at that moment, allowing him to collapse on his knees and let out an agonizing scream, from both the pain of a broken/fractured bone and the loss of Izuku. Izuku was upset. Furious. Betrayed. Why, you may ask? He was still very much alive. He could feel his own pulse and the noticeably close sound of breathing, like a effendi dog was sitting right next to his dead ear, indicating that he was not in the other life. He did not have a quirk. It seems as if Katsuki has finally lied to the boy. It was only a matter of time, he supposed begrudgingly, no longer holding a prolonged admiration towards the boy. He had made Izuku fake his death. How was he supposed to admire that bullshit? Reluctantly, he allowed his eyes to flutter open, being faced with a ceiling he knew he did not recognize. It looked rather weakened, but still seemed to be in a clean state nonetheless. A few drops of water slid down a nearby tube attached to the corner of a wall, soon allowing said tube to connect to a large tank of water nearby. A few plastic cups laid around on the floor of the room he was harbored in, and it was then he realized that he was actually in a bed. Why was he so calm about being in a place he didn't know of? He'd typically be panicky with a human being, and yet being kidnapped didn't seem to faze him much. He tugged a little at the covers to pull them over his chest a bit more. He had free movement, luckily, as anyone could have scooped him up and used him as they pleased, before furrowing his brow a tad. That still didn't explain the very close breathing. With another bile of reluctance swirling up in his chest, he slowly glanced over to his side. What he saw was not something pretty, but not something completely and utterly disgusting either. Its jaw was slacked as a long tongue drooped from between two long tusks. Much to Izuku's surprise, no drool slipped from the insides of its gaping maw, rendering him with the mere thought that the create couldn't produce the needed enzymes, or saliva, as many intellectuals in his school decided to call it, to break down food or salivate like a regular canid. Its 4 eyes watched him closely, the yellow-green coloring giving off a strangely calming aura for Izuku. Hesitantly, he reached out and poked its nose. It leaned away from his hand a bit before tilting its head at an abnormal angle and sniffing at his fingers. It then let out a distorted gurgle that could be compared to that of a human baby's giggle before nudging said fingers with its smooth head. Izuku then took up the newfound time killer of petting the new and elusive creature at his bedside in this strange area. It didn't take that long for a dark purple warp to slowly take form in the middle of the room. The creature he had been loving on pulled away from his hand and let out another distorted gurgle. This time it sounded like a baby whining mixed with some sort of snarl, and that combination of sounds as a standalone sent an unwanted shiver down the seated boy's spine. He had taken to sitting upright against the peeling wall behind him and the mattress he was seated upon, so he could clearly see the growing portal in the middle of this room. Soon enough, a misty figure with some sort of metal collar. Could it really be called a collar? Izuku didn't know, but it kind of looked like one without any context and what seemed to be yellow-streaked eyes within the mist that could be referred to as their face. Said eyes narrowed at the sight, but not in disdain. The figure looked amused before they simply cleared their throat and bowed a tad in greeting to Midoriya. Unsure of how to reply, the boy sat still. The figure didn't seem to mind, instead opting on fixing their formal attire without any real hassle. "Ah, you're finally awake, Midoriya Izuku. We have been awaiting your awakening for quite a while now. Rosebud was growing suspicious that you would never wake up, as was Sensei and a few others of our league. Please, if you can, follow me. If you need assistance, do not hesitate to tell me. Rosebud can help carry you." The creature bowed their head a little, signaling that they were the Rosebud fellow being mentioned as a helping unit. Holy shit, someone's actually being nice to him? And they named this sweetheart Rosebud? How cute! Izuku visibly relaxed and kept his little fangirling to himself for the moment, slouching his shoulders for a moment before turning to slide off the bed. His legs wobbled under the new weight that probably hadn't been applied for hours. Honestly, he would have fallen hadn't it been for the pair of arms suddenly lifting him off the floor and carrying him over towards the misty figure. How long had he been out? Approximately almost 2 days, Midoriya, the misty male answered, causing Izuku to jump a bit. He couldn't really do much since Rosebud was holding him up with their not so surprisingly strong arms. And my apologies, I have forgotten to properly introduce myself. I am Kurogiri. Pleasant to meet your acquaintance on such a short notice. Izuku blinked a few times before nodding, managing a shaky smile before going back to his neutral sheepish look. Kurogiri merely nodded back at the two before entering the portal soundlessly, being closely followed by the towering monster that carried a small boy in their arms with the utmost care. The warp had led to a dimly lit room. It vaguely reminded Izuku of the torture chambers he'd see in the horrors movies he often watched on repeat whenever he was waiting for his mom to come back home after a long day at work. He frowned a little at the mention of his mother before shaking it off. She'd be better without him. Nothing to worry about. Back to the room's appearance. No need to linger on the thoughts of what he'd probably never see again. A low snarl erupted from his heart at the accusation that he'd never see his mother again, but it was brushed off fruitlessly. No worrying. None of it. It seemed as if a single light hung from whatever ceiling the room actually had, illuminating only the middle of the locale as everything else was shrouded in a darkness that seemed way too comforting. A silence hung in the air, aside from Rosebud's light whines whenever Izuku attempted to walk and began to wobble. The creature had already put him down, but kept a close set of eyes on him whereas the other set peered around. It was creepy to look at, as much as he didn't wish to admit, for he had grown fond of the strange beast, so he instead focused on where Kurogyari was continuing to lead him. The misty male then stopped in front of a statue with some sort of mask adorning its face, hiding the features of said statue. It resembled a male. There were tubes extending from the mask, too, but it didn't seem to notify Izuku that the statue was actually a living person. Since it seemed inanimate, he safely assumed that there was no sign of life within the towering body. Not safely enough, however, for Kurogyari began talking to the statue. "Sensei, Midoriya has awoken," and then Izuku panicked a bit when the statue stirred at being addressed, but calmed himself when Rosebud barked a little at him. The noise was oddly similar to that of a canine's, and Midoriya just so happened to be a big dog fan. Probably why he was so calm around the creepy but cute Rosebud. Said four-armed and seven-fingered creature then plopped down onto their rump and observed from a questionable distance. They seemed to be wary of the distance between Izuku, Kurogyari, and the man upon the seat, so this thing didn't have an unlimited sense of fearlessness. Good to know. Kurogyari bowed to the statue-like man, thus causing Izuku to hastily do the same due to him, not really knowing what to do. He has come willingly and seems to have created some sort of bond with our more prized and developed Numu Rosebud, Kurogyari continued, almost directing a one-sided conversation hadn't Sensei tilted his head to the side a bit to show that he was listening. "I personally believe he has some sort of prowess to him. Maybe you should reconsider your option of turning him into a mindless Numu as well." He was going to originally be turned into what Rosebud, the Affinji terrifying monstrosity that seemed to only react to verbal and physical commands, was? Hell no. The man in the chair shifted a tad. He then seemed to have leaned forward as well, but it was hard to notice due to the lack of light within the new environment. Izuku had to squint to see the male's face in the different light, as he had shifted enough to conceal half of his body in the darkness of the room. Rosebud clicked their teeth together from their spot. Other than that mere sound, it was silent. The silence calmed Izuku a certain amount, dissolving the fear of being destroyed and turned into a mindless creature that stole children or something of the such. Now that he thought about it, a monster stealing children sounded pretty amusing. He peered over at Rosebud for a moment. They stared back at him before retracted their eyes into their sockets in the form of a prolonged blink, before focusing on Sensei, who seemed to be studying him closely. Said man rose up in hand and used it to cradle what Izuku deemed to be his chin from the mask. The tubes erupting from the matter flailed a tad before stilling once more, only moving when the man moved. This sensei guy reminded Izuku of a phantasmal figure, something you could see with your two eyes, but could never really touch. Something lacking a physical structure. Now that he thought more about it, the word would be more fitting to explain Kurogyari's body, which was simply held together by clothing and that metal brace around what Izuku deemed as his neck. He hadn't been aware of the fact that he had began to mutter until Rosebud let out a childish groan and the two males leaned forward to listen more closely. "Ah, you seem to be correct about his intellect, Kurogyari." The masked man finally spoke up. His voice startled Izuku. By that, it simply meant that he jumped a bit and almost tripped over his own feet when he attempted to back up a single step on instinct. Sensei lowered and weaved his hands together in a formal manner as he spoke. "I'll reconsider it. For the time being, that is." If Rosebud has already taken a liking to the likes of this boy, he might be special. Izuku rocked back and forth on his heels in a nervous manner. Ah, Yukatsuki. Now I can't act like a normal human being. Now I just might die by the hands of someone else than myself. FINGBSTRD. He snarled in his mind. He also seems to have some spite in him, the male said as if he had heard his thoughts. At this point, Izuku immediately covered his mouth, believing that he had said something aloud regarding his more recent thought. Kurogiri merely pat the smaller boy on his head, slowly calming Izuku surprisingly enough. Kurogiri, if you would please exit the locale and tell the others about the new recruit, that would be greatly appreciated. It spoke once more, raising a hand to cradle his chin area once again. Izuku let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding due to the now known fact that he wasn't going to get mushed into a new shape. He was going to have to work alongside these guys. Better than dying, he presumed as he peered over at Kurogiri for a moment's notice. Said man, who was made from mist that slowly evaporated as it whipped around in the atmosphere, merely bowed in response before opening another warp portal behind himself and disappearing into it. Said portal then closed off as soon as he made his way through it. Sensei then leaned forward. Rosebud shifted around in their spot, staying quiet as they observed from a reasonable distance. Izuku twitched a tad. Now, Izuku Midoriya, could I interest you in joining the League of Villains? And then the twitching stopped. Katsuki was, in a word, suffering. Apparently, the monster that ran off with Izuku he hadn't seen or heard anything about the male since he had been taken 2 days ago, aside from the news droning on about how a middle school boy apparently committed suicide and his body was dragged away by some sort of creature had broken a decent amount of bones from that one move, more specifically, his abdomen's lilac crest, which basically made him the equivalent of someone who just got there but pounded in during section. Not only did he damage his lilac crest, he also managed to crack a few vertebrae, which basically put him on house arrest with a back brace. Itafing. He had lost Izuku. He had never gotten to apologize for being a crude piece of shit and properly address the strange emotions he harbored towards the poor boy, had some of his own bones broken by some disgusting piece of sheet monster, and he had bruises on his wrist. Someone's gonna FNG talk about how he got banged and is into binge, and he wouldn't even be able to blow them up because the doctors said the explosion would overwork the muscle tissue within his arm, thus causing it to explode. Bakugo groaned, banging the back of his head against the pillow fluffed up behind his head. He then glared at the ceiling as the TV in front of him began to drone on about the Izuku Midoriya incident. Midoriya Izuku, 13, and assumed to be deceased, as a body has not been found yet. A suicide note was found atop of his school's roof, revealing that he supposedly had jumped off said roof and ended his own life. The note has been summarized into the boy merely being driven to some sort of mental insanity and wishing to get a quirk in the next life, as someone who mostly likely drove him to this path has informed him or fed the thought of committing suicide. His body, as stated beforehand, has yet to be found, but officials believe that the body was dragged away by an entity assumed to be stealing children and eating them alive. Bakugo wished he had the drive to change the channel, but he didn't. Instead, he laid in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the news drone about an issue he knew about already. That's a lie, he thought stubbornly as the TV began talking about how Izuku was going to be confirmed as dead if they didn't find him in the next day or two. He clenched his fists. He's not dead, he attempted to reassure himself, but the fact that whatever the hell ran off with Izuku was now with him plagued his thoughts. Izuku was probably dead. He dubiously accepted that fact, sinking into his mattress and groaning at the added pressure to both his wrapped abdomen and his back brace. This is all my effing fault. Izuku was happy. Up it even. He had a quirk now. Not to mention an amazing costume to go with it. Well, added with the new room, friends, FING phone with everyone's contacts on it, just in case. He had started crying when they gave it to him, thus causing a lot of concern to rise as Rosebud merely dragged him away, and set of weapons, both attached to his body and as simple objects. The boy hopped up and down excitedly in front of a mirror within his new living quarters. He was checking out his new costume for the 5th time, happy that he'd be able to wear it outside for the most part to cover up the fact that literally everyone in Japan who watched the news or went outside read. Everyone in Japan believed that he was dead via jumping from a high platform. Looking back at the experience now, he shuddered a tad. If he had died, he wouldn't have met all of these amazing people. His previously dull eyes had lit up with excitement, the irises practically glowing thanks to the mirror's reflection and the small tinted window beside his bed in the strangely domestic lair. He vaguely remembered there being a bar and a downstairs that led to a basement. His first and new best friend, Toga, stated that they had pizza and games downstairs, so that was pretty cool. This was more like a cartoon to him, where the villains hung out in bouncy castles and stuff. Izuku's eyes skimmed over his costume once more. A dark green full-body hoodie-like jumpsuit with a black belt, elbow pads, knee pads, some fingerless gloves for his quirk. He shuddered at the mere mention of his new quirk, his eyes sparkling as a faint blush hinted over his face, and with brand new black boots. A mask accompanied it, and it looked amazing in Izuku's perspective. For FS sake, the mask looked like a giant bear trap. How could he not find it amazing? It stretched all the way to Izuku's cheekbones and had a pair of latches attached to it so he could ring it around his face without it falling off. He wore it around his neck for now, but he'd be excited to wear it out in public someday. He then glanced over his shoulder at the more cheeky attribute of the outfit. A bunny tail attachment was attached to where his butt was hidden by the costume, but he didn't mind it much. People would, at best, assume that he was some sort of underground hero or something of the such. He'd be able to get away with things much easier. If it wasn't obvious enough already, he had accepted the invitation to join the League of Villains. His phone vibrated quite loudly from the perch it was settled upon. A dresser, to be exact. Rosebud, who had been gnawing on a shoe toy beside his little futon, pushed out their gums like a goblin shark would and snarled. In his few minutes of getting to know the villains and Rosebud, he had already been told by Kurojiri, his new misty mom, that Rosebud hated loud noises and could be calmed by the simplest of things. Somewhat like a canine, actually. Izuku found that oddly adorable. Izuku merely trilled, moved to pat Rosebud. It calmed them almost immediately, for they slouched back down and returned to gnawing on the shoe toy, then skipped over towards his phone. He lifted it up, unlocked it with his self-made password 1800, hilarious, wasn't it? Not really, then scrolled through the many notifications. Many had sent him one text to see if they actually got the right number in, weirdly enough. Couldn't bring himself to question it, though. When he found the most recent one, it was from Toga, who he dubbed as his blood buddy, because of their similar quirks. He tapped into the conversation immediately with a bright smile that reflected off of the phone's surface. Izuku's smile stretched further across his face, revealing his brand new fangs that appeared shortly after Sensei gave him a quirk. Rosebud could be heard letting of a baby cry at the sight of the smile, although it was mocking. He tapped away at the screen immediately, already filing out a response. He got a reply almost immediately. His phone vibrated in his gloved hands because of it, thus causing Rosebud to snort at him before merely tossing the shoe toy and slowly dragging themselves after it. Izuku sneered a tad at the lazy behavior of the creature that had suddenly erupted before checking the response Toga had given him. He glared at the phone. How the F did she type all that out so fast? Before brightening up once more quirks, she says? Sounds overly tempting. He hesitated at the mention of destroying All Might, but his quirk seemed to haze over his previous beliefs of admiration for the symbol of peace. Besides, if heroes saved everyone in need, where were they when he was on the roof? Izuku frowned a tad at the mention of the roof. He then shook it off before going into a mental conflict on how to properly reply to the text message. Yes. His new and shiny quirk was simple. He could consume the blood of anyone, no matter how large or small the portion is, and gain their quirk. The stronger the quirk, the tastier the blood. Made him a borderline cannibal if he enjoyed it too much, though. He remembered Kurojiri having to hold him back from biting Dabi's shoulder off when everyone allowed him to get a small dose of their blood as both a welcoming gift and a boost. He continuously apologized to the scarred male, who didn't seem to care much for the fact that he had almost been eaten, so he was forgiven. If he could get his hands on All Might. Izuku visibly shivered at the mere thought of being able to crush anyone with a single punch, a blood-filled blush clouding his face for the moment before it died down when he calmed his excitement. Didn't Katsuki want to go there, too? He liked his lips at the thought of consuming his blood. It'd taste amazing, he bet. This quirk was doing things to him, he swore. As if he wasn't having a mental conflict with his cannibalistic and bloodthirsty quirk, Izuku gingerly typed out a response before placing his phone back down onto the dresser, leaving the device in favor of stripping out of the new costume and trading it in for a more casual set. If anyone realized that he was the kid that was presumed dead, oh well. It'd happen someday. Izuku merely dragged his tongue along the edges of his fangs as he slipped into a black tank top that had the word in white bold letters, tank top, written on it in kanji, some gray shorts, and pulled on a light blue jacket. The dressed male bid goodbye to Rosebud, who huffed in retort, before doing the same to the members, who seemed to be aware of the fact that he was going through with the boss plan. Time for some payback. Izuku was in a good mood. A very, very good mood, actually. He was wandering through the streets for a decently long time, finding samples of blood in alleyways and popping them into his mouth. Around 90% of the blood he tasted churned his guts, meaning that he only got another useless quirk in his arsenal. However, there were a few blood samples that riled him up, thus causing him to slump against the alley's wall in an attempt to calm his senses and also searching for a place to train properly. He didn't know why, but he also had an aching want to visit his mother and tell her that he was alright. That's a lie, he knew exactly why he had that want. He knew his mother would feel horrid with the thought of her own baby dying by the hands of himself. She needed to be reassured. Izuku whistled a soft tune. Icicles, by the Scary Jokes. He remembered the song's name and its creator after a moment of dwelling on it, and swiped through his new phone's contacts lazily. His whistling had slowly muffled itself due to the sound of yelling erupting around him, however. He really tried to not care too much for the loud excess noises surrounding him, though, even if it was tempting to shrivel up and run away on instinct, isn't that the boy who jumped off the roof? Somebody call the police and cancel the case. Someone do something about this. Can people really come back from the dead? Izuku instead put all of his focus on another text message that his other friend had sent him. Izuku shifted on his feet, maintaining a more slower pace in his walk as he opened up the new conversation between him and Dabi. He held back a small snort at the message, successfully dulling out the yelling from bystanders. Izuku smartly chose not to reply to it. It was simply Dabi wishing him good luck with his training session. Besides, the scarred man would merely spam his phone with those stupid emojis he insisted on using he did not know from experience, but Toga had mentioned that Dabi was an emoji freak and would gladly spam anyone with literally anything without any context whatsoever if they replied to him on a meaningless post. He allowed his eyes to trail away from his mobile device lazily, his eyes lidded due to him having been wandering about for around 2 hours. He had departed around 8, actually, so that estimation of time was actually quite true. His pupils dilated a tad at the sight of so many cameras being pointed at him, so he immediately looked away and began to speed up his walking back to its neutral pace. How he had went unnoticed for that long of a time, he did not know, nor did he essentially care. Izuku just wanted to get away from the growing crowd. At this point, he believed many people thought he was vagabonding, despite the clean set of clothes he wore shamelessly and the fact that they were far too focused on taking pictures/videos and yelling at others to call the police. So, because of his own suspicions, the boy kept his posture straight, not wanting to come off as brooding or some sort of mindless Numu or the such. Shigaraki had happily explained what the Numus were, even allowing him to keep Rosebud and one other that he had yet to name as little companions. Not that anyone would know about the human experiments, really. He wanted to look proper, not like some sort of slob. He sighed at the fix-it in his wording. It's good, but he'll have to improve on not stating the first things that come to mind when accessing subjects or more formal matters. He could get into some serious trouble if he continued with that thought process of his. Izuku was just excited to be working with his new family. They seemed sane enough, save for how one of them named Nada nipped and tore into a pile of human organs without even casting him a glance. When she did look at him, it was only to let him have some of her blood, then she went back to ignoring him. Dabi mentioned that she was supposed to become a full Numu, but only got through the process halfway before the systems shut down on her and seemingly gave up. Izuku had dubiously pitted her on instinct. He was being a hypocrite, but her quirk allowed her to cause natural disasters, create life forms she knew the insides of out of her skin, and even control vines and plant roots, which then would leave total wreckage upon her own internal organs if she didn't consume the needed fluids to create said things beforehand. At least he had a reason to have the urge to eat someone. Izuku traced the inside of his cheek with his tongue, wincing every time someone pointed over at him with a flabbergasted expression or an abrupt exclaim. Were they really making that big of a deal over a quirkless teenager jumping off the roof, disappearing for 2 days, and then walking down the street without a care in the world? Apparently they were making a big deal of it. He shrugged to himself, adjusting the blue jacket on his shoulders and flattening out the slight wrinkle in his breathes as he continued to make his way through the bustling streets of Japan. He had risen his head from its craned positioning to be able to watch where he was going, but he regretted it to an almost limitless extent. Many had continued to point out that a missing teenager had appeared oh so suddenly, whereas few others, kept to themselves. Izuku could see them picking up their phones and dialing in only 3 numbers before beginning to talk hurriedly. Why the F do you need to drag the police into this? People just can't mind their own business nowadays. Izuku forced himself to ignore the burning stares. That, however, proved to be hard when you weren't looking down at something else, so he decided to peer back down at his mobile device once more. His blank stare turned into a glare of sorts as he looked down at the phone, opened the App Store, and began scrolling through the possible choices of time-killing apps. His eyes widened a tad when they landed on a more familiar game, Sugar Crush Saga. His eyes glowed momentarily before returning to their dull and lidded exterior, his fingers mechanically going into the related games section and pressing on a dragon adaptation of the game. He pressed the download button before pushing his phone into the slightly messed up yellow bag he had grabbed from Kurogiri before departing. A strained noise similar to that of a grown man grunting mixed with the feminine touch of a woman hissing erupted from the bag in retort to the harsh way of hiding his phone while it wasn't really needed. He had forgotten about the other Numu that decided to sleep in his bag for the time being. Izuku snorted when he felt legs skitter up the back of his neck, humming when they stopped on his slightly exposed shoulder. The jacket continuously sagged a bit on his right shoulder despite his best efforts to keep it straight, showing off a minimal amount of skin. At this point, Izuku didn't really care, since it was already starting to get hot and he didn't want to start sweating uncontrollably. The small Numu was merely a praying mantis, and he had been indecisive on naming her either Mango or Rosemary to match with Rosebud, and due to the fact that the praying mantis looked like a pastel pink cherry blossom whenever she laid down, but she seemed to merely reply to the former more than the latter, so he settled on Mango. "Hey, Mango," he whispered surprisingly softly to the Numu, who merely rose up 2 arms and pat the side of his face affectionately. The animal Numus were said to have more free will and be more affectionate than the human ones, depending on what they were mixed with. Izuku was just glad he got 2 of the nicer ones, Rosebud and Mango, instead of the more hostile and bloodthirsty entities. "Sorry about the ruckus with my phone. People are just nosy and I don't know how to handle the attention, so I tried to waste some time. Forgot I had you with me." Half of that statement was true, whereas the other was somewhat false. She took the apology with some disdain, patting the side of his face again before pressing her small mouth against his cheek in the meek form of a kiss. Izuku barely stifled the small laugh from the affection she was placing upon him so abruptly. Mango made a small noise from her perch near his neck. She seemed to be comfortable, so Izuku removed his attention from the settled Numu, who really didn't look like much until she enlarged herself to focus on where he was going. Apparently, considering the fact that he continued walking on autopilot whilst staring at the small creature, he managed to move out of the more crowded area of the locale and to a more desolated area. The reason why the area was desolated was because of the mounds of garbage piled up in a nearby beach. At least, Izuku thinks it's a beach. There were specks of sand visible in the clusters of trash, and he could just barely see a giant body of water. He blinked a few times before approaching the trashed beach, tucking his hands into his shorts pockets and shifting the weight of his shoulder to slump a tad. The jacket slipped onto his right elbow, thus causing Mango to squeal and latch onto his neck to avoid being thrown off. She then squeaked loudly in his ear, causing the boy to chuckle a tad before hopping into the crease that led into the beach. Izuku looked around a tad and clicked his tongue against the roof of his mouth in a bored-like manner. "This seems like a good training spot," he hummed, raising a hand and watching as sparks began to crackle from his palm. The sparks dulled out before seeping back into his hand, acting like a heavy object in a pool of water. Izuku pursed his lips before letting out a small sigh. "But I can't use Dabi's quirk unless I want to be arrested. Toga's quirk is no good there and twice. No, he went a little crazy with his quirk, poor guy. Shigaraki's quirk will just make more of a mess with all the dust it produces, and I don't really think Magna nor Spinner's quirks would help with moving the trash around anyways. Gecko isn't all that stupendous when cleaning up trash since it's used to climb and stuff, and magnetism can only work on people." The hand he had brought up to inspect was soon back at his side, dangling without a purpose. "So maybe I should train my physical body? It's really the only way to do this, isn't it? Mango, what do you think?" By the time he had come to a conclusion in his mumbling, Mango had hopped off his shoulder, shifted into a form that was about 5 feet 7 inches. He didn't know why she could change her height and mass, but he chose not to question it due to people being able to be born with FING toy cars as their head, and laid herself out across a dirted and trashed couch that was laying around nearby. She made a small noise of approval in his choice, but immediately propped her chin up on the armrest and stretched out like a lax cat. Izuku merely sighed at her lack of enthusiasm. Were all the Numis this lax? Before skittering over towards the smaller pieces of trash, time to clean up a beach, he supposed. With that thought in mind, Izuku carried a few plastic wrappers and cans from a spot and trotted away to put them in a nearby trash bin. Mango merely snorted at him and watched the waves brush against the sand. Bakugu had been staring aimlessly at the ceiling for a while. He didn't really know why, but he blamed his lack of sleep today and the added homework his teachers had decided to send to his mother to print out. The science homework that was sent in to him due to him not being able to be at school for the time being was far too easy to complete, leaving him to his own devices after a solid 30 minutes. That, and because of the fact that he had decided to pass out around 8, his body had forced him awake to use the bathroom, and now he couldn't sleep at all. His eyes began to twitch slightly as the TV's news popped up once more, causing him to groan and force himself to lay back down in an attempt to ignore it. Of course, that didn't work out for Katsuki, for he listened intently for an update on Izuku's case, as he had been for the past few hours. This just in, a quirkless boy, who has been declared dead only a few hours ago at approximately 8:02, has been sighted walking along the streets of Mizudafu without any noticeable markings that would declare him as being harmed or the such. Civilians witnessing the scene have caught it on camera, observing the stated to be dead boy with panic and astonishment. If anyone can get a hold of the boy, please report to the police station immediately and give directions to where he may be as of right. Here is a video that was submitted by an anonymous bystander. To be honest, Bakugu was already hooked on the first sentence. Of course they had to mention that the boy had been quirkless to get his attention, but that was because he was still holding on to the hope that Izuku was still alive and well. He didn't know if he would be considering to become a hero if Izuku died. The fact would probably spiral into a descending staircase of tragedy and guilt, which would probably attempt to consume him at some point. Stop thinking about being guilty over someone dying when they probably never want to see you again, Katsuki. With that being said, he propped himself up on his elbows and attempted to watch the television screen. He stifled a groan of pain when the back brace pushed a little against his spine, whereas the cast around his abdomen merely tightened a little, only managing to see the video they mentioned pop up in a small box near the reporter's head. It was slowly zoomed in on, soon taking up the entire screen. The video consisted of a boy with all too familiar freckles dotting his cheeks and vibrant green eyes to match his shadowed hair walking down the sidewalk casually, peering down at his phone as if he hadn't been the Midoriya that jumped off a roof and left a suicide note in his absence. As if he wasn't aware of the fact that most of Mizudafu was freaking out now that someone who was labeled as deceased was now walking around the block. It was terrifying to know that he seemed blissfully unaware of the carnage he caused. Bakugu's throat went dry as the boy glanced over to the side, revealing that it was actually Midoriya Izuku. Those eyes held more emotion in them than they did last time he saw him, before jumped off the roof. The blonde couldn't help but swallow down a lump in his throat. He clenched his bedsheets before letting out a soft sigh. He was relieved, but the smallest speck of fear finally decided to speak up. So what did the giant monster F do to him? Bakuga didn't fall back asleep until the news finally stopped talking about the upbringing of Izuku, which merely ended around 11. Izuku hadn't chosen to stay on the messed-up beach. Wisely so. He remembered seeing some weird lanky man standing nearby, watching with concentrated blue eyes as he cleaned his new training area. Izuku believed that he may have been someone who also enjoyed the beach when it wasn't a garbage site, but the possibility of him being a Pefli lingered in the back of the green-haired boy's mind. With that being said, he had quickly gathered up his things, his bag, a few scales he had left behind whilst utilizing Gecko, and a dead crab to give to Nada to see if he could win her over, and allowed Mango to make herself at home in his breathes pocket due to his bag now being overcrowded. He hadn't chosen to stay on the messed-up beach. But that didn't mean that he wasn't currently on said messed-up beach. In his defense, it was Mango's fault. So, in summary, Izuku Midoriya, someone proclaimed as dead for approximately 7 hours before he suddenly appeared in a living physical state, was sitting on the beach, not willingly, but still sitting on the beach nonetheless. He was in crisscross applesauce position, his shoes tucked under each other somewhat stiffly as he folded his hands. He had done a pretty good job cleaning up the beach, as one could be able to see at least half of the ocean from a mile or so away, but garbage still towered around to remind him that he was yet to be finished. But there were a few UPS to the disposal of some of the garbage. It didn't stink as much. Mango laid beside his seated form, staring off into the distance with the sun steadily changing how her hide looked in hindsight. Her usual vibrant green had dimmed down to a desolated reddish-orange, and Izuku couldn't tell if that was because of how she was made genetically or just because her hide reacted to the sunlight like so. He chose not to think too much about it. The lanky man was gone now. Izuku didn't know if that was a good thing or not, but he didn't feel any unknown eyes on him anymore, so he felt a little less tense. He'd always be tense, but Mango's presence mixed with the sounds of waves in the background calmed him a moderate amount. Then Izuku remembered two things. One made him happy, whereas the other annoyed him quite a bit. One, his mother. She'd be joyous to see that her son wasn't dead. Izuku could stop by and tell her about his current situation. She'd understand. Inko Midoriya always understood. She'd probably just want him to be safe, and this was as safe as he could possibly get right about now. For as long as he was safe, she'd probably cave in with enough reassurance, and maybe she'd even be able to meet Kurogyri. The two seem like they'd get along quite well from what he's seen of the Purple Mist's personality. He smiled, but it soon delved into a frown at the second thought that entered his head. And two, he still had to go back to junior high. Now that he wasn't dead, he was going to have to uphold the responsibility of showing up to that med school. God, that was going to SCK. People would either try and resolve their wrongs or continue being big DS to him, and he knew the former would occur with his new ability to basically copy quirks, just pretend to have Dobby's quirk and play it off as if he's a late bloomer, he reminded himself for future reference. It'd be exhausting and annoying at the same time. How joyous! He let out a low groan at the second realization, leaning back and almost falling if it hadn't been for Mango's abdomen cushioning his fall. The Numu hissed softly at him, stretching out her front legs and scratching at the sand when she realized that he wasn't attempting to smother her backside. I'm gonna have to go back to school and visit my mother, not to mention the amount of police that might follow after me due to me supposedly faking a death, Izuku muttered, threading his fingers together and closing his eyes somewhat wearily. Mango hummed, the vibrations echoing throughout her entire spine. Midoriya and Mango laid there, staring off into the void of space and letting time pass by. Soon enough, the sound of Mango thrumming and the air breezing by gently called Izuku to sleep. If only he realized that he stayed out to sleep at midnight. People found him by the time the clock struck 8 a.m. This just in. The quirkless boy who was presumed dead but confirmed to be alive has been found sleeping at an abandoned beach, but not only that, he was being guarded by what one could presume as a companion quirk. Said companion refused to allow authorities to get between it and the boy, and more officers are being called to the scene as we speak. Izuku doesn't have a quirk, was Bakugu's immediate thought as he chewed at the cereal he had been eating in bed. He could move to an extent, but his quirk was still pretty limited and he couldn't bend over without popping a bone out of place, so he opted on simply getting cereal and eating where he felt most comfortable with his current physical condition. The explosion user still couldn't go to school by request of both his mother, father, and his doctor, so he basically spent his time watching the news to see if Midoriya was still doing okay. It was disgusting to see the person who made another want to kill themselves try their best to watch out for them in the end of it all. But Katsuki Bakugu was someone you could call disgusting, but at the price of your own pride and dignity, and nobody wanted to give that up. So he wasn't given that label quite yet. He shoveled another spoonful of cereal into his mouth before grabbing the remote and turning the volume up, narrowing his eyes at the live feed that was shown on the screen. It displayed rows of riot police and regular parole officers attempting to surround a large insect monster that loomed over Izuku's sleeping body. This could only go downhill, Bakugu thought grimly. The large praying mantis-like creature loomed over the resting body of Izuku, who was simply curled up into himself and holding onto the thing's abdomen like it was a fang pillow. He seemed to be blissfully unaware of the fact that police were aiming guns and tasers at the demon beast, but maybe it'd be better that way. The creature, however, had its chin split out into 4 separate parts and was snarling and hissing loudly at the bystanders and offenders, holding out their arms in an aggressive battle stance. Their antennae vibrated and they snapped at an officer that attempted to grab Izuku and drag him away. Nobody knows what this creature is or why it's guarding the boy's resting body, but police forces will soon be forced to use violence to cull the creature and safely retrieve the boy. Bakugu winced at the sight of the entity raising up onto its hind legs, thus causing Izuku to faceplant into the sand. The action alone caused him to jolt awake, scrambling away from the line of officers when they advanced forward. Bad idea, Bakugu chanted softly to himself, squinting his eyes in a somewhat pained manner as the creature screeched again. Why the hell would you mess with that thing? He whispered under his breath, having known that he shouldn't be one to talk after he tried to tackle the first monstrosity and got his bones annihilated because of it. It reminded him of the 4-armed monstrosity that took Izuku in the first place, but that's not what really unnerved him as of right whilst watching the live feed. The mantis had froze in place, almost as if someone had used their quirk. The armed riot police, they were making a big scene out of this entire thing, weren't they? Held their fire, soon beginning to lower their weapons when the creature showed no signs of moving. The feed showed a single riot police advancing forward, reaching out to grab Izuku. So close. So close. Their gloved hand brushed against the male's elbow, and then Izuku yelped. Without any real warning, the entity surged forward and drove their long arms into the police officer's chest. Bakugu's breath hitched in the back of his throat as the arms drove themselves deeper into their chest until the ends were just a little visible. Screams echoed around the scene, but they deafened out at the scene being shown on the local news channel. The live feed slowly began to die out, beginning to dim a bit and have some glitch blotches near the edges of the frame, but not without showing the creature dig into the armored riot police that foolishly approached them as if they weren't wearing anything and beginning to rip them into 2 separate pieces. Blood gushed out of their body wound and splotches of gray matter mixed with crimson red and chunks of body mass flew all over the audience. Bakuga didn't want to know what the gray matter was. Was it the brain? That shouldn't be possible, but it got Bakugu on the verge of hurling. Lungs, entrails, the heart. Why is this happening? He should have looked away. Kidneys, liver. Why was he still looking at this? But he didn't. The live feed displayed the mantis stabbing into the person's chest repeatedly with its other set of arms, even as others began to attempt to gun it down, the sound of gunshots nearly drowning the sound of distant sobbing and screams of horror. His pupils shrank at the gory scene, gagging as he forced down his cereal when some of the blood smeared onto the screen before it had died out completely. He hit the replay button to rewind and see what was happening other than the mass murdering that had probably occurred. On the first rewind, he noticed that Izuku never moved from his spot. Bakuga didn't see anyone try and scoop him up whilst the monstrosity was assaulting the crowd. On the second rewind, Bakuga realized that the feed stayed on long enough to produce an actual audio, and he wished he hadn't heard it as he had been zoning out on the animated murder of a single officer, the pain scream the officer let out as they were ripped into before it merely became the sounds of one's blood being dropped onto the ground in gallons, the tearing noises of tendons being ripped away from one another and entrails being pulled from their natural course in the body. Splat of every single piece of internal matter that hit the ground, the crunching of their solid bones. And that's when Bakugo turned off his television and stared at his now soggy cereal. He wasn't hungry anymore, instead feeling a deep sensation of both dread and utter disgust. He wanted to hurl but couldn't. He didn't know why his body messed with him like this, but considered it as karma for messing with the poor boy on the news feed. He moved his bowl and placed it on a nearby dresser somewhat shakily. Bakugo didn't like the news anymore. He used to watch it all the time, but this was too much for him. He didn't want to see this every day. He didn't like the news reporters anymore either. No, he really didn't. But he never could bring himself to stop watching. With a speck of hesitance, Bakugo flipped the remote in his hand and pressed the power button once again, allowing the television to boot up and continue the news report, which seemed to be more tense now. This is his fault. It's always his fault when it comes to Izuku Midoriya. Izuku felt indifferent about the situation that played out when he woke up. On one side, he was upset that he had to wake up to see a bunch of strangers crowding him as if he were a pro hero. His younger self would have adored that thought, but that was nothing more than a copy and pasted dream at this point. His new objective was to be nothing more than a spy that gathered information in the place he once wanted to belong. It was a decent task, actually, and maybe he could pretend to play hero one more time by himself, without Katsuki always making him the damsel in distress or the villain. Izuku cringed at the memory, tightening his hold on Mango's abdomen as he shuffled closer to the angered Numu. She spanned out her arms further, opening her mouth in a gnarly scowl with a low rumble. She snapped at the officers that dared to grow closer, threatening them with her larger arms and practically attempting to cloak Midoriya's body from view, but to no avail. He focused on his thoughts again. On the other side, however, he was excited about how many officers there were. So many vessels that harbored different quirks. He sighted someone with a long tail and a pair of horns among the crowd, smoke slowly slipping out of the edges of their mouth as they spoke hurriedly into a phone, alongside an far younger entity with a ragdoll-like body attempting to move away from their parent, who simply tugged on their scruff and pulled them back in a way that seemed all too vicious. Izuku focused on the child for a moment, his pupils dilating as he managed to deafen out the sounds of clamoring around him to listen to what was happening between the child and their mother. "Mom, I don't want to be here," the child whined, attempting to rip their doll's structured body away from their parent fruitlessly. "It's too scary." The mother wore a bleak expression, pulling her distressed child back to the spot where they once stood with an irk mark present in her veins. She gripped the child's nape harshly, ripping the sewing that kept their body together a bit. The child yelped and let out a cry at the ripping. Izuku flinched at the cry of distress, causing Mango to freeze up and look down at him. She crooned softly in an attempt to get his attention, but it didn't work. "That's bad. Why is she hurting the child? The child did nothing wrong, did they? They're only scared of Mango, right? That's bad. That's bad. That's bad. That's wrong. I want the child. Get the child, Izuku. Get them, Izuku." Izuku visibly stiffened when something brushed his elbow. He was so deep within his thoughts about the harmed child, which were also affected by the multiple quirks in his body, primarily this stranger quirk that was named Cerberus. Said quirk was a mutation, one that Izuku couldn't handle correctly yet, as he had little control over the dogs that sprouted suddenly from his nape and they immediately began making a ruckus, thus making him withdraw the quirk before Rosebud went feral out of surprise that he hadn't noticed the approaching police officer attempting to take him away from the only protection he had as of right now. Mango was doing nothing about it, simply staying in her frozen state and staring down at him for any signs of discomfort. The officer pulled on his elbow, and he yelped. Mango was quick to react to the small noise, screeching and lunging at the unsuspecting officer with no remorse. The bystanders screeched out in surprise, nearly drowning out the oddly satisfying noises of tissues being torn from their original places and bones snapping into irregular shapes. He was only able to see the blood pooling out from the slowly worsening wound Mango had inflicted upon the heavily armored officer. Shigaraki wasn't even kidding when he said the Numas were made to challenge All Might's own strength. Izuku reckoned as his typically lax and affectionate companion tore into the body as if it were some sort of chew toy. The other police on the scene soon managed to drag themselves out of their thoughts, lifting their firearms and beginning to shoot bullets at his friend. Out of mere instinct, Izuku squeaked and did his best to hide behind Mango's abdomen, thus causing the officers to fire at her face instead. Mango did not like that. As the Numa's aggression was only fueled, Izuku continued to stay back, not wanting to interfere for two key reasons that he found rather important if he were to accomplish his newfound goal with Sensei and company. Said key reasons consisted of the following two things. 1. Bullets. The boy wasn't very sure about his own abilities, alongside the fact that he would end up making himself a wanted vigilante if he decided to even try and attack the shooting officers. Not only did he want to blow his cover, as he was already working with the League of Villains, but he really was lacking in the department that gave him some sort of quirk that kept him from being blown into smithereens if he were to come into contact with a bullet. Besides, Mango seemed to be doing just fine on her own, as she continued to shred through the now fleeing group of officers and bystanders, all of which were screaming out in either anguish, fear, or on the officer's side simply calling out for assistance. And 2. His FING instincts were telling him to focus primarily on the child who was still frozen, as their mothers seemed to have forgotten about their small form. Izuku could only will his body to twitch every now and then, resulting in him staying stationary and pulling his knees close to his chest. It hurt ignoring the quirk's natural instincts, but he did his best to do so. He instead focused on the amount of blood flying out in every direction due to Mango's messy killing tactic. Some of it even landed on his face. His tongue darted out to lick it away, said tongue being longer than usual thanks to one of the quirk samples he found in the alleyway. He had tested it earlier and dubbed it as frog, as he was able to stretch out his tongue and jump like said animal. Izuku wondered whose blood he swallowed to get the quirk. Once the crowd had died out a considerable amount, the boy took notice of how the child managed to disappear among the fleeting bystanders. Thank God, because he was about ready to give in to the quirk's instincts. Said instincts died down a bit, soon resting on a soft simmer that managed to calm Izuku's nerves a bit. However, his head began to slightly ache due to the clashing of multiple mindsets. He attempted to ignore them, but that was easier said than done, so he focused on something else for the time being. Izuku watched quietly from the sidelines as Mango ripped open another officer, screeching angrily as the bystanders finally disappeared elsewhere. Once they were out of sight, they were out of mind. The Numu snorted, dropping the corpses she managed to accidentally pile on her elbow blades and beginning to groom herself. Izuku blinked several times before sighing softly, his stomach churning due to him attempting to withstand the urge to lick the blood off of the ground. Tiny boy, one of the two voices from the Cerberus quirk thrummed in his head, you should stop harming yourself. It's not good for such a young soul to be putting such physical strain on your body like so. Have your companion gift you the blood herself, but be careful as you wouldn't like to end up like those corpses piling up on the pavement over there, would you? Izuku blinked again, furrowing his brow at the oddly soft voice. The quirk hadn't done that before, so this was an oddly pleasant surprise. He had some sort of mother figure in his head that would help him with his newfound stomach pains from refraining his quirk's urges and gave him helpful ideas/advice. That's pretty cool. Said voice was gone as soon as it came, but it culled the churning of his stomach momentarily since he had focused on something other than the massacre before him. With a soft grunt, he managed to push himself off the ground and wiped off his breaths, huffing at the sand that continued to stick to his rear. He couldn't find it in him to dust it off, so he merely trekked over to stand beside Mango and start up a body count. Lifting a hand meekly, he counted each corpse, his stomach soon roaring for attention when he stopped on the 13th person. Not that many, but still a decent amount to alarm the public and the media, as he took notice of the cameras some people were holding. Mango! The entity halted in her grooming session and let out a low rumble, turning her head diagonally to gaze curiously at her friend. Izuku lifted his counting finger to his mouth and did his best imitation of a cheeky smile. Can I have some of that? Mango made a noise with an unknown meaning behind it, but she lifted a pincer to his face anyways. Izuku's cheeky smile shifted into a more grateful one. Katsuki was feeling a little better nowadays. Physically. Not mentally. His back brace was still in place, but his abdomen had apparently been set during some expensive surgery his old hag paid for on short notice. The laughing gas was apparently super effective, as he had been knocked out for quite a while after being hauled into the hospital for the third time this week. He faintly remembered bits and pieces of the visit itself, but he was primarily focused on the news reports now. The teachers didn't really care much if he wasn't in school. He was smart enough to have covered most of the topics they were currently talking about, so homeschooling with the work they sent over via email and having it turned in by his mother or father was enough for them to be unconcerned. So he often took the time to complete a week's worth of homework before returning to his resting position and skimming over the main news channel that was droning on and on about the Izuku Midoriya incident. Reporting in from the nearest police station, riot officers have confirmed that Izuku Midoriya is currently being held captive against his will by the strange creature that took about 13 lives during a mission to apprehend said entity and get the male to safety. The boy was reported to have been screaming and thrashing against the hold of the creature, which was also reported to have been holding him close to their chest in a possessive manner. The police were forced to evacuate after the bystanders and civilians were dragged into the situation, but even then many lives were lost. What the police have to say on this topic will shock you. More at 5. And then it cut to a commercial about adopting shelter animals. Katsuki narrowed his eyes at the television screen accusingly. His ears may have been a bit deafened from his quirk's drawbacks and whatnot, but he was demon sure that Izuku wasn't in that thing's arms. He remembered Izuku being perfectly fine with the entity protecting him from the officers. For all might's sake, the boy was sitting passively in the sand as the giant tore into an officer. The news would do anything to get attention nowadays, wouldn't they? He leaned his head back against his headboard and sighed softly, closing his eyes and attempting to relax. His hand fumbled with the remote before pressing the channel button, thus causing the commercials on the TV to cancel out in favor of some old All Might show. Katsuki opted on watching the retro shows in favor of the now false news claims. Time passed relatively quickly on both ends of the spectrum. On Izuku's side, in the span of only several months, he managed to grasp the ulterior motives of the League of Villains, have a wholehearted conversation with his own mother about his suicide note and disappearance, befriend some of the other Numis and even found some subjects to create said life forms, get a pet scorpion that Nada found digging around her dinner, and managed to become closer to the League themselves. Not only did he manage to achieve this in such little time, Izuku also managed to come to terms with the fact that he'd cross paths with Bakugo and simply toy with him a bit. Besides, Izuku mildly remembered his one-sided attraction for the male when he wasn't told to kill himself for being weaker than the rest, so why not keep up the act of innocence and happiness that had morphed into something only his close friends and mother could see? He couldn't find it in himself to go against the plan. So he didn't. Izuku laid on the floor with his pet scorpion crawling along his spine, scribbling down notes into a damp and beaten-down notebook titled, Hero Analysis for the Future Number 13, in tainted and blurred pen. The writing itself was almost completely incoherent to human eyes, Izuku and some of the Numis being able to read it clearly due to the amount of quirks they possessed. Of course, Izuku was utilizing a quirk he had recently gotten dubbed the name Library, as it allowed him to read any word, properly pronounce it, and define it both verbally and mentally. To this day, he still questioned what type of bloodline you'd need to have to get something like that as a power. His scorpion, who was named Xeno, because of the timing which he had obtained her when he got a quirk that practically screamed alien, probed at his bare back, picking at his scabs curiously before moving to skitter around once again. She was a docile little thing, really. Toga told him that Xeno had clung to Nada's unkempt hair when she attempted to eat her without hesitation, which made the senior cannibal drop the entity and gesture Midoriya over in the first place. Izuku believed the creature had been tested on, resulting in the cat-like docility and curiosity the DMN thing sported. Xeno, stop picking at my scars, Izuku drawled lazily, lifting a hand to stifle a yawn. It came out anyways. I know you're bored, But they're healing and I doubt Nada and Rosebud are going to stop with the more intense training, even if I'm bleeding out from behind. The scorpions stopped for a moment before beginning scuttle around once more, their pincers skimming Izuku's back. The male furrowed his brow, sure that the entity would stop with the picking when given a good reason. Zeno picked at another scar, thus causing Izuku to sigh and go back to his daily activity of writing in the nearly decomposed journal. The green-haired boy had bulked over the months, as he managed to rid the abandoned beach of its trash in an astounding 5 months, using the remaining 2 to properly get acquainted with his variety of quirks. Mutation quirks similar to Cerberus still spoke and listened to him occasionally, but only when he needed the guidance or person to rant to, whereas emitters like cremation made him feel rather powerful, but the drawbacks still maintained their severeness. Burnt himself on the hip when he accidentally activated a quirk called microwave upon being startled by Rosebud. Izuku, who was once 5 feet 5 inches, was now standing at the somewhat marvelous height of 6 feet 0 inches, meaning he managed to spur on his growth spurt, or maybe it was because of the quirks not having enough space in his body to bestow upon him 5 inches in height. That fact made him smile a bit as he began to doodle in the corners of his page, as it was something that helped to calm the constant feeling that he'd probably go insane at some point soon. Some point soon, he noted whilst shading his chibi picture of Zuko, a Numu he practically named after himself upon its creation. Not now, just soon. Zeno soon scuttled over into her little section of the room, besides the large sleeping figure of Rosebud, who was laying on her side in an incredibly small doggy bed whilst snoring softly. Smaller entities surrounded the largest one, curled into her side or isolating themselves in a nearby corner where the Numu's tail laid. The scorpion clambered into the slightly larger bed crafted from napkins and a few fake leaves, flopped down, then presumably fell asleep. It was too dark to tell. Izuku couldn't bring himself to care that much, even if the pet was the first one he had gotten. Where the F did Nada get those corpses from, anyways? He'd ask her about it when she feels like talking to him. As he wrote, Izuku absent-mindedly reached up to gently caress the sides of his neck, his face cringing a little at the long scratch marks going full circle. The training he underwent with Nada left horrid marks, as she choked him until he tapped out, completely out of breath and his neck so squeezed that his esophagus felt frail for 3 full weeks. His fingers trailed along the talon-like outlines scattered across his nape, soon fleeting away from the prominent wound to trace the smaller or far larger ones on his biceps, elbows, wrists, chest, fingers. He had scars everywhere, really. Not one place you could look. No, you can't look at his D and not find a relatively deep nash or scar. Stop thinking about your FNG scars, like Angel Midoriya, a guttural voice snapped from beside him, and he didn't need to turn around to know that it was one of the weirder Numus that were still practically human, if not more engrossed and rude. Said Numu was his favorite Numu, Zuko, who really didn't have any documents on their actual creation, so he safely assumed that the original form never got it checked out and died before they actually could. Would explain the small child corpse in the nearby dumpster of the alleyway he slurped the blood up from. Gross, you sick F dash. You're thinking about slurping blood like you sick dick dash. Izuku lifted his pen and tossed it at the entity, smiling to himself when said entity howled in feigned pain before cackling like a madman. Zuko was practically a Numu created for both crowd control, much like Rosebud and Mango, and diversions such as red, yellow, and green. Yes, very clever names for the distraction makers, so they were made for enduring pain, much like Izuku does. So, even though the pen hit them dead in the eye, they cackled, seemingly tickled by the action as they pulled the item out and dropped it back at Izuku's open palms, wiping the excess gore from the wound as Izuku hurled the pen into the nearby trash can. "5th pen I've thrown into your socket today," he muttered. "I know. You've been hitting me, you F dash." Zuko barked, baring their 2 jaws at the male before dropping onto all 4s and skittering over towards the mountain of sleeping Numus. "I was trying to make you shut off those demed thoughts, but you just had to throw a diamond pen into my socket." Izuku rolled his eyes. The half-Numus were so exaggerated with their vocab, this one almost reminded him of Katsuki, but in a good way. "Yes, a very good way. I'm not a D-sucker," he retorted, sighing and dragging himself towards his desk to grab another pen when Izuku stopped responding to him. Izuku's new life was fairly quaint, to say the least. Fairly quaint. Tiny child, that's not a good way to utilize that word. May I suggest, chaotic? Fairly chaotic. Thanks, he whispered before going back to his scribbling upon finding a suitable pen. A low rumble of recognition resonated through his head and he temporarily managed to forget about the cursing festival Izuku had wrought upon his poor ears to appreciate the motherly voice in his head. "You're effing sucker," Izuku jested from their spot. Izuku lifted his empty hand to cradle his face, sighing into his palm as Izuku began to speak once more. This was it. Izuku's gaze was deadpan as he stood at the gates of UA. Several others hopped past, only one, a tiny 3 feet 7 inches girl with horns thicker than her own skull, peeping out a small, "excuse me," that made Izuku move a little. She sent him a small smile before skittering off elsewhere. She didn't seem to mind his deadpan expression. She seemed nice. Would be ashamed to have to murder her someday. Izuku stifled a scoff at the thought. Rosebud heaved out little bread breaths beside his ear, hunched over and rolling her eyes around to observe the new environment. 2 people gagged at her. She snarled back at them, causing them to yelp and flee. Izuku paid the interaction no mind and stroked her untamed mane laxly. Rosebud purred and leaned into him. She staggered a little, swaying over her own weight as she tried to properly balance herself. The far smaller male pushed her back with no malice. "Don't act out," he instructed quietly. "Mango is practically on eternal house arrest back at the BA home." Izuku's eyes fleeted for a moment, scanning the environment filled with chattering and excited teenagers around 15 or 14 before focusing back on the Numu in front of him. "Back at home," he corrected finally. Rosebud sneered at him, pulling back her gums and cackling softly. The sound reminded him of a baby screaming out in pain, but at a softer pitch. He inhaled harshly and stifled a whimper that the Cerberus quirk wrought upon him. The hounds disliked baby noises. "Quit laughing," he muttered, pushing a lollipop past the borders of his lips with a small hum. "We have a job to do." The boy furrowed his brows when some bystanders shot them looks at the laughter. Rosebud abruptly cut off the noise at the sudden command. Since she was still a Numu, she was still awfully obedient to any command someone told her, so was hasty to cull the repetitive sound of a baby wailing. She stared down at Midoriya for a moment. The male sighed and removed the lollipop from his mouth. He then tossed it towards the creature's mouth, scrunching up his face when she threw out her tongue to grab the item and swallow it whole, including the plastic stem. Loose pieces of cherry red scraps drizzled out of her saliva-drenched maw. She then regurgitated the stem and breathed, halting the enzymes and spitting them out. Crushed and undigested scraps collided with pavement as Rosebud smiled. Izuku sighed. They had no time for this right now. He moved to yank the creature forward a little, making sure he didn't hurt her as if he could. She was literally a hunk of massive muscles and weighed around 90 tons before advancing through the school gates. At the moment, he was quite happy that the authorities managed to drop the suicide of Midoriya Izuku seen a few months back, thus meaning that nobody really paid too much mind to the fact that someone who was declared dead and then not dead 7 months ago was roaming passively with a giant entity at their side. It was nice. Rosebud swayed beside the male, eyes fluttering shut whilst thrumming out small melodies. Izuku vaguely the melody resembling the lullaby music he'd play on his phone so the Numis could stay asleep. Rosebud probably learned it to comfort either the others or herself. Either way, it was surprisingly nice and made Izuku relax a tad. And then he remembered 2 vital things. 1, Bakugo Katsuki was going to attend the same FNG school and he'd be demed if that boy tried to converse with him. 2, Izuku was in his pocket. Like, he was literally inside of his pocket. Izuku halted for a moment, thus causing Rosebud to grumble and the tiny bunnyman Numu to squawk in their squeaky mouse voice. "Keep fucking movin', kid," the chibi-sized Numu barked, the little bunny ears on their head flopping dramatically as they swore. Their exposed brain twitched a little as an irk mark appeared near the center of their dome. Izuku stifled a chuckle at the morbid yet amusing sight. Rosebud nudged him forward, lacking her typical tusks since they had gotten sawed off by Shigaraki and Kurogiri. Yes, they were sold, but that was how they trimmed the creature, as the tusks grew to be extremely hazardous since Rosebud liked hugs and tackling people. Alright, Rosebud, try lowering your size so you can actually fit in the doorway. And the Numa did just that. Nobody noticed the blonde-haired boy, standing still at the open gates to you, staring with wide eyes and shrunken pupils. Especially not Rosebud, who curled her gums back to soundlessly threaten the distanced male before ushering Izuku into the auditorium and slithering after him after shooting Katsuki a look. Nobody noticed the boy, who was the only one who gave a DMN about Izuku's disappearance in the first place other than his mother. Hopefully it'd stay like that. Wonderful. Great. Fing dandy. Diamond peachy. Oh sheet. No. So. F me over a diamond chair and call me baby boy, you goddamn mother few. Please don't do that actually. All of these words could be used to describe Izuku's past and present thought processes. XPLCT, vulgar, and incredibly confusing. Yes, he had gotten into U to A with ease thanks to his quirks and Rosebud and Zuku's combined brute strength, but there was always a FNG price. Boys. Bakugo had tried interacting with him on several occasions and Numu was in reflexive aggro mode. Rosebud nearly bit off Bakugo's hand when the male grabbed him by his wrist before the exam contestants dissipated from the area on the last time. He remembered it clear as day, although it wasn't something he really wanted to. Cerberus just tended to stockpile these memories for future use. Against his will. Tiny child, stop throwing your tantrums and consider the fact that you consented to us remembering these events. Right. He consented to that one. Izuku had been raring to go, as was Rosebud and Zuku. The latter had been nagging Izuku all day before the exam, practically biting off his left ear with all the clicking that came from his dual mouths. It was a shame he never did it. Izuku could have lived without hearing Zuku's fussing and handcrafted insults/threats. The former, on the other hand, was quiet for the most part. She often stole off into the crowds of people, her eyes narrowed and her gums pulled back to flash her 12 remaining teeth. Note: force Rosebud to use her enzymes more often to avoid an unfixable toothless situation. Izuku hadn't been sure why at first. But then he noticed the lingering looks he got from a certain boy from his childhood. Ah, shit, Izuku inhaled deeply. He was prepared to pretend to be on friendly terms with the male, despite him driving him to his imminent death that didn't happen because of Rosebud trying to find another victim to Numui's, mind you. Izuku is well aware of the fact that he'd be dead hadn't he reached out to pet Rosebud. But he really wasn't prepared for the fact that the male looked like he was on a FING mission. That glint in his eyes reminded him too much of the explosions that rippled from his hands whenever he grew angered, or his emotions couldn't be tamed, or, "Tiny child, you told us you disliked this one. Can we devour him?" "What the no, what the hell?" he yelled to himself. Nobody seemed to hear his talk with the mutation quirk that engraved itself in his brain. "You dislike him. We can devour him and the dislike would be gone. Our child mustn't have this negative energy swelling up." Izuku stifled a scream of, "Please stop talking." He opted on quietly shushing the helpful quirk, which worked exceptionally well in his opinion, as the quirk apologized softly before dissipating as it typically did and turned on his heel to leave the area. Well, he tried to leave the area. He was stopped by a warm hand grasping his wrist. Probably Katsuki. Definitely Katsuki. Rosebud snarled loudly. Her fur bristled and her 7 talons clicked together rapidly, sending off warnings in their own types of vocals. "Rosebud," he started, knowing the Numu would kill the owner of the oddly warm hand holding his wrist in a tight yet shaky hold. "Down." The Numu slumped, whining softly before looking down and sniffling. "And he's gonna have to apologize for that latter." Rosebud always looked hurt when he told her to do something like that when she was trying to protect him. Zuka scoffed, lingering at Rosebud's side and lightly nudging her face with his arm. She barked softly at him in retort. Bakugo narrowed his eyes, but was still visibly shaking under the presence of Rosebud. Maybe she had done something to him before? Shigaraki did mention that she attacked someone. Izuku. "Oh shit. That's a new one. Izuku inhaled stiffly once again, remembering his training as he peered over his shoulder. Emerald met Red in a coliseum of unknown emotions. Most of them hailed from the typically frustrated male's expression. Actually, Izuku had trained his poker face, utilizing it in the situation to seem like a completely different person. However, he managed to will himself to actually light up at the sight of Baku. Katsuki. Izuku took in the way Bakugo seemed to wince at the mention of his first name. A way to silently torture him, he presumed giddily as the false happiness on his face turned into a slightly truer variant of it. I haven't seen you in almost 8 months now. How's it? Bakugo grunted, cutting off the male with a glare. Sure, Izuku wasn't actually intimidated by the look anymore, but he could still pretend pretty well. The glare melted quickly, almost as if the male noticed that Izuku was frightened by the look, and shifted to something foreign to both parties. Don't call me that, he huffed. Call me that shitty nickname you made up when we were kids. What? Tiny child, you're not breathing, the familiar dog quirk reminded mellowly. Oh shit. Katsuki was really pushing his luck here and it showed. His first string of luck came from actually being able to talk to the male. Second was not getting his body torn to shreds by the demon monstrosities that were apparently Izuku's quirks. Third was the fact that this Rosebud Beach was only intent on intimidating him. For now, at least, Rosebud had calmed considerably due to Midoriya's command and Zuku's light jests. Now the dual-mouthed humanimu wasn't paying her any mind and was playing with one of Mr. Compress marbles. Zuku always seemed to have a knack for tormenting people. She wondered if she could get him to use the marble on the porcupine that was harassing her young companion. She was still eyeing the male wearily, as Katsuki had made Izuku freeze up at the proclamation of continuing to call him the childhood name Izuku had unconsciously forced himself to forget. Her eyes bulged out of their sockets when Izuku retracted his hand and fumbled with his hands. It was fake embarrassment mixed with tints of nervousness. Rosebud knew her companion's facial features better than any human. He was obviously jesting, but humans were far too delicate and absent-minded to really take in the smaller details according to Kurogyari and All for One. Katsuki wasn't special, he took the fake impressions and believed them. Like fing idiot. Rosebud snorted at the humorous thought with a menacing glower. Red irises darted over towards her, expanding as they hastily focused on Izuku again. Rosebud clicked her teeth quietly as the exchange continued. The only thing different was that Bakugo was sweating more than he was before as he practically forced Izuku to become his friend. Izuku almost regretted not letting Rosebud bite Bakugo's hand off, but what could he do now? Izuku was having a relatively good day after Katsuki dismissed himself, although the male had trailed after him, constantly spewing out questions on his whereabouts and trying to be subtle with said questions. Sure. He was hungry and the two Numis seemed to never cease in their chatter now that they were lurking in the alleys, but that was fixable. The day was far better off without the blonde. The boy narrows his eyes at the shadow of an unknown figure laying in the alleyway he was navigating through. Nobody came to these alleys, primarily due to the strange amount of related deaths all caused by yours truly occurring in said areas. The figure was still but Izuku could hear their breathing. Tensed before deciding on trying his luck to get some lunch before heading back to base. Excuse me, Izuku starts, putting on an innocent voice he practiced not too long after befriending Shigaraki. He wrings his hands together and does his best impression of a distressed teenager. Rosebud stifles a snort whereas Izuku peers over at the figure curiously, cautiously. Zuka's eyes drop, but Izuku pays no mind to how hysterical the creature suddenly looks. Do you need help? I was just coming here to take out my trash and... Drop the act, human. The figure shifts and their head lolls to the side a tad. Izuku chokes on his words. Zuku visibly stiffens at the gruff voice and allows his eyes to dilate, showing off his initial surprise or fear. It's hard to tell. Rosebud wails, but in a startled manner rather than a sad or humored one. The voice was familiar to the trio, but it never really was welcomed. The figure's, known as Nada by the League, voice never seemed to radiate anything but despair, regardless of her current emotion. Nobody really seemed to want to talk about her, nor would they wish to meet her in passing on a mission. Everyone did their best to avoid her other than Toga, who was someone she tolerated over many of the other members. But there she was, slumped over and glaring up at the three through her lashes with her hands buried in a corpse. Fresh blood dampens her already baggy and messy clothing, and it baffles Izuku that some of the red substance got on what's visible of her forehead. She twitches a little before baring her teeth at the three. Rosebud steps back and Izuku plops down onto all fours. Neither try to look like a threat or a human. That leaves Izuku vulnerable and open for grabs. Hideous at the sudden scent that wafts out of Nada's flesh-filled mouth when she opens it again to snarl. Izuku withdraws from the scene just a tad. The stench of raw flesh has him reeling, and he fights his quirk in order to keep himself in check. Hunger gnaws at him disapprovingly. Nada slides her tongue out from her tusked mouth and laps at the blood drizzling from her hands like a parched traveler. Her spine practically lurches out of her back, and Izuku tries to ignore the thought of gnawing the thinning flesh near her bones. Nada wouldn't taste good, she'd taste far too sweet. Her quirk is powerful and would probably send him into an uncontrollable frenzy if he thought about even nipping at her skin. The thought of picking at one's skin has him reminded of Zeno, and he relaxes a tad. Nada quirks a brow in his direction before wiping her saliva-covered hands on the sides of her dampened breathes. Izuku doesn't want to know if the dampness came from the victim's tears, blood, or something completely different. It's better that way. Hands sent me to get you, is all she says before lifting herself up and glowering. Her two beady eyes little become heavily emphasized with the glower, and Izuku's happy mood drops to nearly an all-time low as he shrivels back into Rosebud's warmth. She's cold from her own bewilderment. Ah? Shigaraki sent you? Nada snarls once more, and Izuku quiets himself for the second time in that alley, looking away from the aged woman with a horrendous quirk that Izuku never would dream of using. Come, says Nada, and without question, lest you want my teeth. She turns to drop onto all fours and crawls away from the three. She expects them to follow, he deciphers after taking a small moment to register her flawed Japanese, or she'll kill them. The thought accompanied with the sight makes Izuku shiver, although he's truly no better than the cannibalistic half-nu. She's probably a full Numu at this point, but he's trying to give her some respect. You're far better than Nada, tiny child. She has long lost herself. You haven't. Not yet, he thinks grimly, and the quirk doesn't reply to his thought. He frowns. Rosebud nudges Izuku forward, pressing him to walk slowly after her. He does so stiffly. Izuku whispers something, then he's trotting ahead of them and carefully timing his steps. Making sure his footsteps aren't too loud or his furred paws never touch Nada's bandaged feet. It was strange how tense the happy atmosphere had gotten upon Nada's appearance. Nobody whispers a sound, and if they do, they're silenced by Nada's icy glare. Now that he knows he won't be snarled at or even dragged into another training session if he looks, Izuku peers over Nada's strange features as if he's one to talk. The facial expressions of an elderly woman show in the furrow of her brow and the sullen cheeks of someone who's seemingly been starved, but that's all the resemblance to an actual human that Izuku can see. Other than the facial expressions, she only has a slightly rounded chest and practically no waistline. It's obviously abnormal to look at but still interesting enough to have attention. The green-haired boy silently thanks whatever gods are out there that it's far too dark for anyone without a night vision quirk to properly see anything anymore. He keeps his pace behind the wrinkly entity who went by the name of Nada, with Rosebud and Vu forming a line beside her. Izuku takes the time to observe his colleague more. Much like Rosebud and Izuku, she has 4 arms but lacks the fur that the chaotic duo has. Instead, she has rough, scarred light blue skin with white hues painting her chest and wrinkles that adorn her chest and nape only. Everything else is either muscle or somewhat flat. Of course, she has 2 eyes that practically glow in the dark with their equally blue hues, and Izuku finds it somewhat disturbing in all she is a palette of soft blues. She's not soft. He's been allowed to slide her head once, and it was hard and wrinkly and disgusting. Nada clicks her teeth together and Izuku nearly steps on her swishing tail. He inwardly screeches and reels back, swallowing a sigh of relief when she didn't seem to take notice of his close call. Rosebud shoots him a sympathetic look for forcing him to the back row before looking forward again. Izuku does nothing and says nothing, if hunching over a tad bit more than he already was could be classified as nothing. Izuku goes back to analyzing the cannibal to calm his racing heart and slightly labred but quiet breaths. Her head was oddly dome-like. It reminds him of the Predator in the old Predator movies Bakugo would force him to watch. He grimaced at the memory and sidestepped her tail again. Moderately long spikes protruded from both the sides and the top edges of the back of her head, each and every one of them taking on a dark blue hue. Some stacked atop of one another whereas others were lined messily. They go from the end of her skull all the way down her spine, ending near the tip of her tail. All of them twitch in unison, as if they're sentient and know Izuku is watching them. He stiffens but keeps walking. As he had done all those months before, he finds himself pitying her again. The woman, no creature, that wrought scars upon his body and nearly tore him in half with her training regimes, where she would only fight and never speak. He had no right to pity her. Izuku focuses on the last feature he finds interesting before he's cast away to the depths of despair if he trips up on her body language or accidentally touches her. Her tail was like a monkey's, he notes. He narrowed his eyes a bit at the swaying lump of flesh. In shape, and in length and speed. She's wrapped it around his legs once and thrown him into a tree before, successfully putting him in coma for several weeks. Powerful quirk, take it, his own head demands, and he shakes his head so fast that he forgets that he's trying to avoid losing focus. He loses focus just as Nada's tail does another sweep near his legs. It sweeps over Izuku's boots, nearly tripping him hadn't he pushed his heels back. The tips of his boots brush against the skin of her wrinkly appendage and Izuku hastily recites his last words in his head. He tries spewing all of them out, but can only manage one. Nada didn't take well to being touched, even if it was an accident. He bore witness to her tearing a villain a new one just because they accidentally dropped a single pint of whiskey on her head while she was dining on a piece of vermin. Izuku fears that he'll end up like that villain, forgotten and dismissed without another word. Nada falters in her steps a tad. Rosebud whinnies like a horse only with a baby's voice and Izuku rears up. Both are tense and worried for the outcome. But nothing happens. The elder soon picks up the pace again and everything returns to normal. Rosebud is no longer in distress and Izuku falls back down onto all fours as to not be recognized as a human entity. They make it to the base and Nada peers up at Izuku for a moment. She then rears back on her haunches and snorts. Right in his face. A misty wetness cloaks his nose and it's just then he notices Nada has a mouth that's split into fours that's horribly identical to the predator he used to cry about to Bakugo, Kaken. Rest, blood buddy, says the entity, and then she's crawling into the cat bed Toga and twice made for her a few days ago to rest. It's like a slap to the face. The term of endearment shared between him and Toga specifically due to their similar quirks being used by the cannibal that would gladly eat his sleeping body and spit them out at all for one's feet hurts. And Izuku doesn't even know why. He can't calm down, even when he's curled up beneath his covers. Izuku is laid along the ragged rug that he claims to hate. He's curling into himself and staying quiet, which would be an impressive feat hadn't it been from a chance encounter with Nada. Rosebud is residing somewhere in his moderately large closet, her whines audible from his bed as she unassumingly makes a nest from his discarded clothing. Only two of them share the imminent horror he feels at the moment. Zeno only makes a small sound before crawling onto Izuku's back. Zeno picks at his scabs once again, but he doesn't ridicule the scorpion this time. Izuku didn't mean to open the door so forcefully. It just so happened that he spent the rest of his sleepless night lifting weights and, reluctantly, going to train with Nada. At least she was kind enough to leave very few scars on his body and never seemed to bring up the incident that happened yesterday. Probably was because she didn't feel like tormenting the boy today. Back to the door. As soon as he swings it open, he resists the urge to cave in on himself at the foreign feeling of eyes focusing on him. There hadn't been 20 villains dwelling in the same area all the time back at the League of Villains base, so this was fairly new to him. Rosebud appears at his side and merely crouches when a few eyes drifted over towards her, but the spotlight was on Izuku. It stays silent for a long time. The atmosphere grows tenser by the second and Izuku is on the verge of, "Oh, you must be Midoriya-kun." A voice chimes, and Izuku flinches a little at the warmth of the voice. He can feel eyes narrow at him, but he tries to ignore them. A giddy brunette, who's only about 5 inches shorter than Izuku himself, is the first to skitter over and apparently the owner of the warm voice. She's obviously happy, regardless of the tense atmosphere following the 6 feet 0 inches boy. She straightens up and beams at the green-haired boy. He almost feels blinded by her aura. "I'm Uraraka, the one you saved from the rubble with your quirk? It's great to meet someone with such control over their powers, especially if they already know to just jump in and save people." Rosebud croons at the praise. The sound alone urges the girl to turn on her heel and start loving on the entity with her padded hands, keeping a pinky out at all times. The green-haired boy wonders what her quirk is before accessing the situation. And then it comes back to him. Izuku almost forgot that he allowed Zuku and Rosebud to wander off and gather some points for him while he focused on getting rescue points. She must have saved this girl, for Uraraka was looking at him and her way too fondly and Rosebud was getting all the pats she could possibly want. He does his best impression of a sheepish shrug, making good use of his remaining awkwardness. It's no big deal," he utters, watching as Rosebud allows the girl to knead at her pelt. Izuku finds himself getting soft at the sight, so he does his best to make good use of it. Rosebud likes saving people. It's probably just from instinct than her actual training. Uraraka continues another flow of gushing over the newfound information just as another student approaches Izuku. Yes. The tall glasses dude who ridiculed Midoriya for his muttering. Hard to forget such an annoying face. However, instead of any more annoying noises flowing out of the male's mouth, he bows deeply at that. "I apologize for my past misconceptions. I have taken notice of how you work with your quirk and how it enables you to mutter things aloud, and I'm deeply sorry for ridiculing you for it." He then straightens, and Izuku is taken aback from how the attention has drifted away from him now that people approached him. Well, that and the misunderstanding with how his quirk works. But a white lie never hurts anyone. "I am Ida Tenya. A pleasure to meet you." The boy booms and holds out a hand to shake. Izuku had already managed to filter out the greeting a little, opting on shaking his outstretched hand and saying, "Pleasure to meet you too," as he takes in his surroundings. Bakugu is staring at him. There's a majority of boys compared to girls. The only open desk is behind Bakugu. Bakugu is staring at him. The teacher's desk looks kinda cluttered. Bakugu's staring. Why is Bakugu staring? Stop staring. Stop staring. Stop staring. "Ryakuen? Did you hear me?" Midoriya blinks a few times to clear the fog from his head. The mental quirks must have gotten out of hand again. He'll need to work with Nada and twice to raise his endurance to their influence. Uraraka, who holds Rosebud's head in her hands and cups her wrinkled cheeks so softly that he has to do a double take to comprehend the image, smiles at him. "I asked if you named her Rosebud, or if that was just the quirk name she came with," she chimes. Izuku takes notice of how she dips her thumbs into the softer parts of the wrinkles scattered across Rosebud's cheeks and caresses the ridge of her pointed nose. Ida seems to be interested in the conversation as well, as he leans forward to listen in. "I named her. My quirk." He pauses to create a fake name for the quirk that he's appealing to. "Configure allows me to create entities of any kind, for the price of some personal issues. I name them so I don't get mixed up." Rosebud sneers and nuzzles Uraraka's hands, urging her to continue her onslaught of pets. She complies. Ida pps his head at the mention of personal issues, but leaves it at that. "Well, that's certainly interesting. However, I would suggest we return to our seats so we'll be ready for class." By Rosie. Can I call her that?" Rosebud wails. The sound startles several people, but she seems awfully happy with herself. And all Izuku can say, all while staring at Bakugu, who stares right back with his left pupil shadowed by his unruly hair, is, probably. The school day ended quickly. Izuku vaguely remembered having to stuff a softball down Rosebud's throat to make her hurl it back out, alongside deterring Aizawa from wanting to look further into his quirk when Rosebud remained sentient in the presence of erasure. Rosebud threatened him when he tried to investigate. Izuku fears she only made things worse. The green-haired boy settled on an earnest trot, awaiting Bakuga's presence any time now. The blonde typically managed to track him down, regardless of his location. Almost as if he actually paid attention to the routes Izuku took to get home back in junior high. He scoffs at the idea. Bakuga wouldn't care for his well-being unless he tried to kill himself and pin it on him. Izuku grunts and stifles a light laugh at the morbid joke of sorts. Rosebud rumbles lowly from beside him in a familiar sign of warning. The sound is similar to all the others she gives him before the blonde approaches. Yes, Bakuga is approaching. Tiny child. That's not the blonde child, the advisor in his head thrums, then they've vanished. It takes a moment to comprehend the information before Rosebud's full-on snarling at whomever is approaching. Izuku takes notice of how she bristles, her fur fanning out threateningly in an attempt to make her look bigger, and looms over Izuku's smaller body. He has to force himself to turn, but stalls a little to weigh the pros and cons of the situation. Possible cons. They could have a weapon of sorts, or maybe they're looking to rob him. Maybe murdering someone to take their mind off of something. Definitely dangerous, and they might react negatively when they notice Izuku knows they're there. The only pro he can scrap from the depths of his mind is simple. Free lunch, he hisses, and Rosebud lets out a loud bellow with saliva leaking from the confinements of her parched maw. Most is SED up immediately, whereas thicker globs fly through the air as she shrieks. What kind of freak show is this? The figure, eyes shadowed but harboring a mouth full of disgustingly yellow fangs and dripping the wafting scent of cigars that Izuku only knows from watching Nada beat an entity, whom carried a cigar and reeked of danger, to death with her bare hands, flicks out a switchblade and waves it, as if it's an actual threat to Rosebud. Come on, you big mutt. Piss off and let me steal some goods from the little boy next to you. Izuku is taller than this person by at least 2 feet. Rosebud cackles momentarily before shifting back to her scarier demeanor. He stifles a scoff and instead reaches into his pocket. Quietly, as Rosebud provides a barrier of anger and protectiveness, he turns on his phone, waits for it to start up, and hums at the time shown. It's around 3:40. If he deals with this quickly, he'll be able to give some food to Nada to bribe her away from the thought of extra training. Sir, if you don't put the weapon away, I'm entitled to defend myself. Izuku's speech is ever so slightly slurred. He's not up for fighting now that he thinks about it. But if he was, he'd like to have someone like Nada to tussle with, someone who'll leave marks behind and scarring memories that elicit a fire in him whenever he has to face them again. However, Nada was not human. She didn't have the ability to fall victim to his false innocence. This person did. The assaulter, who doesn't seem too bright or right in the head in comparison to normal people, thus. You may be tall, but it's not like you could fight back, oof. While the guy was trying to intimidate Izuku, Rosebud took the chance to throw herself forward and press him into the hot pavement. She slides open her mouth and drools all over his face, smearing stains across his cheeks and dropping hot globs of her spit into his mouth. He starts choking on it. Rosebud just adds more and more and his mouth starts to bubble. It was the late afternoon now. Nobody was out to help. Nobody's around to help. Rosebud shifts to look over at Izuku, spit still trickling from her tongue as she lets out another rumble. She feels accomplished, he notes. It's a happy rumble. This is disgusting, child. Says you. The voice goes silent at the retort. The guy's still choking and trying to spit up the thick, inhuman substance churning in his mouth. He croaks, coughing up some and allowing it smear his shady black hoodie and his own face even more. Rosebud looks incredibly smug. He's slowly unclogging his throat, as he was forced to swallow most of the drool. The assaulter takes in a gasp of air when he gets most of it out, only to GG as Rosebud forces some more into his mouth and, God forbid anyone witness this, up his nostrils. He's drowning in her spit. He's thrashing, but he's drowning steadily. Rosebud forces him to stay alive through it all. Izuku, who watched with a strange curiosity, stepped forward. The man rides beneath Rosebud, who holds him down with 2 of her lower arms and sits on his thighs. He draws in close enough to be able to hear the bubbling noises of the man trying to both sneeze out the fluids and spit it out. It's not working. Izuku settles down beside his head. He looks around. The area is still barren, and it's not like people would actually try to stop him since they're so dependent on pro heroes, before reaching over to touch the hood on the drowning figure. He slides it off easily. It's a teenager, it seems like. They look like they've been thrown around a couple of times. His eyes trail over to Rosebud, who has stopped dropping heavy doses of saliva into her victim's mouth to peer over at Izuku with innocent eyes. It's betraying of the fact that she's torturing someone right now. She sticks out her black, wet tongue and looks back down at the male, who's heaving up both drool and vomit due to the morbid appearance of the scene. The slimy tendril-like appendage swings around before slapping the sides of his cheeks, slathering them up with more drool and sking up the residue. His eyes look panicked, and he tries to squirm away, only to GG on the bodily fluids drizzling out his mouth. Leave most of the body intact, Izuku thrums distantly. His eyes have lidded and the forest green dims down to a darker hue. Me and Nada prefer the organs over the external flavors. He reaches over and places a thumb on the drowning man's nape, pushing down to force up more residue. His brows furrow. Maybe drag him into the alleyway so we don't get any surprises. Rosebud nods, drawing away from the male and instead hoisting his vomiting and limp body up. She tucks him under her arm and swallows the vomit and drool she gathered from his face. Izuku watches wearily, not fond of her eating human residue just yet, but treks after her nonetheless. It doesn't take long to dump the body on a couple of garbage bags in a nearby alleyway and fill his mouth back up with drool when he tries to yell for help. The green-haired boy stands in the entrance of the alley, watching out for Bakugo while Rosebud toys with the temporary chew toy. He can hear thrashing and garbage bins being knocked over before he sights a familiar speck of blonde hair accompanied by red orbs in the distance. Hastily, he turns heel to face Rosebud. Her tongue is practically throating the guy, having been stuffed down his esophagus and making a small bump in his chest. Izuku knows he won't last any longer. Anything for food, he guessed. He shushes her and she raises her claws to squeeze at the victim's throat when he tries to scratch weakly at her hands again. The bags rustle. Oida, Izuku! Izuku's green pupils dilated at almost being called Deku. He hastily calms himself down before he does anything rash. His pupils slowly lose their bloated form. What, are you gonna ignore me now? I said, hello. Technically you didn't, but go off, blonde child. The boy stiffens just a tad at how close the voice seems. He's quick to turn around, just in time to see the surprisingly threatening sight of Bakugo barreling towards him. The block seems to have gathered some inhabitants and Izuku is glad they didn't come around to see him and Rosebud and that probably dead excuse of an assaulter. Izuku manages a smile, casually wiping some vomit from his right hand on the inside of his pockets. Bakugo either sees it and refuses to comment or is just that oblivious. Hey, Kakin, he manages to get out, the name tasting sour on his tongue. There's a small crash from behind him and he glances back to see Rosebud pulsing saliva into the limp body, inflating it a tad as it slows in its movements. The man is definitely dead. Bakugo doesn't notice due to him not having the hearing quirks Izuku has forcefully obtained. That, and he's just blissfully unaware. Bakugo seems pleased with the revival of the nickname, puffing up just a tad. He then slouches a bit and quirks a brow. Where's? He pauses. Izuku prays he doesn't see the ghastly act happening a few feet behind him. Yes, the ghastly act of Rosebud forcing body fluids into a corpse and deflating it with her claws, thus causing it to spew out vomit and excess fluids all the same and flatten a decent lot. The organs are the only things left unharmed. For the most part, at least. Bakugo squints a bit before peering to the side. Maybe his prayers have gone to shit. Please don't see. Please don't see. Please don't see. Damn it, what was that DMN thing's name? Rosebud or some sheet? He forgot Rosebud's name. Izuku lets out a quiet sigh of relief, his scarred fingers stinging from the chemicals engraved in the body fluids he forced out of his soon-to-be shared meal. He smears the substance in his pocket, now heavy with stomach acid and half-digested morsels. She's a living entity too. She's not directly bound to me at all times. Izuku thinks of an excuse before blurting out the first thing that comes to mind. She's hunting. Izuku, at that very moment, feels like an airhead. Bakugo stares at him for a long while. His eyes are lidded as they typically are, but he's not scowling angrily. It's one of his neutral scowls that Izuku decided to pay close attention to around 8 months ago, back when he was a little more stable. He buries that thought. The blonde then shrugs. Whatever, duh, weirdo, he says, but the nickname has no malice as it usually did. At least Izuku can linger on the fact that he's tripping up on the Deku alias thing again. Bakugo opens his mouth to speak again but closes it immediately. Izuku presumes it's because of Rosebud. He is correct. The wrinkly beast clambers forward from the depths of the alleyway and laps at her claws. It looks believable that she was out hunting, her feet painted with red hues and her nose dipped in crimson. Her eyes narrow a little at Bakugo's form, but soften after a moment of consideration. Bakugo seems to relax a tad. Izuku pats her chin. Well, I'm a tad bit busy at the moment, running some errands to buy some groceries, so I can't walk home with you today, Kaken. He lies. Bakugo preens at the nickname. Izuku doesn't know why. Wouldn't he be upset to be called that because of that stupid suicide note? It then occurs to Izuku that maybe the note had been disposed of. Oh. Bakugo sputters for a moment, as if he was surprised at his own understanding of the situation. Well, I'll be going then. So, bye. That was awkward, tiny child, his motherly voice hums after Bakugo disappears down the short block. Rosebud hobbles away and comes back with the limp body of the man with ugly teeth in tow. She hides it in her thick pelt, covering the drooping shoes that poke out from the front with her DMNT arms. You're telling me, Izuku sighs in reply. He then nods towards Rosebud and makes his way down the block. He manages to ignore the alleyway being decimated by spilled garbage and globs of chunky spit. You won't have to train today anyways, Nada says as she rips off a fat slab of meat from the recent kill. She gnaws at it for a moment before managing to swallow it down with a pleased grunt. Her eyes narrow a tad. Don't see why you'd have to bargain, but I appreciate the thought. Or whatever you entities say. That's probably the longest Nada has spoken to Izuku. Disregarding his prominent fear of the elder, he merely smiles before going to pick at the smaller morsels of the body. He already knows Nada would flay and roast him if he decided to eat at the fatter muscles. He'd rather live a little longer. Nobody's asked about the scars, says Izuku. The ridge above Nada's left eye raises and he knows that she's quirking her non-existent brow. He smiles impishly. His free hand, the one not filled with the residue of a slowly rotting corpse and internal fluids, moves to gesture at his nape, where long scars scab over the skin in an ugly manner. Bruises throb on the sides and sometimes leak out their own type of residue when probed at. Nada merely clicks her tongue against the roof of her mouth. Probably think it's from Rosebud. Nada nudges over a few slabs of the fat she found in the male's corpse over to Izuku and sniffs at a vein she pulled from the body. She then splayed it over a crescent-shaped morsel of muscle fiber and shoved it into her mouth. Izuku shoveled the fat slabs into his mouth, the taste heavy on his tongue but delicious nonetheless. Really? Izuku questions, but it's far too muffled as he accidentally splays some pieces of the fat across the meal. Nada reaches over to flick them away before swallowing her food. Don't talk with your mouth full, Kurogyari quips from his station behind the bar. Izuku apologizes and returns to his conversation with Nada, which has been going surprisingly well. He picks out a small vein and suckles on it lazily. Nada shrugs. If they do ask, just say it's from training, ain't completely a lie. She shifts and chomps down on the corpse's nape, tugging a bit before rearing back with a juicy piece in her mouth, 'cause you can't lie for sheet. Kurogyari sighs. Mouth, he utters. Nada guffaws and forces the food down before she can spit it out. And keep the profanity to a low. And Sir Tamura already is enough to deal with. Nada and Izuku share a look before they both huff. You're a half-decent liar, but all that training for it is pretty horrid. Not with this guy, course, but you look like an angel-faced baby. Izuku is unsure if that was a compliment or an insult, but he nods all the same. The elder wipes at her mouth with the back of her talons. Better than twice, she assures. Always. Izuku lets out a small laugh at that. Glad to have your approval. Nada's face contorts into something akin to a smirk. She leans back in her seat and brings her legs up to her chest, revealing her tail and allowing it to stick any stray pieces of meat littered along their makeshift table. I'm speaking to you, am I not? Besides, we're blood buddies. Remember? Izuku's laughter fades for a moment and he stares blankly at the creature, who's smiling at him with such genuine content mixed with twisted pleasure, and he suddenly isn't deterred by Nada using the term of endearment. Even when Toga barrels over and starts playfully bantering with Nada about the proper use of the term. Two blood buddies? Sure. He can deal with that. Rosebud saunters over to nudge him, and he calms his thoughts enough to listen in on the bantering. Bakugo is livid. Somehow, someway, and thank All Might himself for this, Izuku agreed to being his friend. No, that's not the thing he's livid about, but it's pretty DMN important. The blonde sits at his windowsill, humming a distant tune as he peers over at the apartment complexes adorning the quiet city his dorm loomed over. He could have gone to the balcony for a better view, but it was chilly out and he wasn't going to fall asleep on a railing tonight. Not after last time, where he daydreamed for the past hour and almost slipped off. He was becoming clumsier after the arrival of Midoriya Izuku, his friend. Bakugo's lips twitch up into a smile that he doesn't care enough to hide. Most people have gone out to enjoy themselves at the moment, as it was only 7:40, but it was close to the time where he'd sleep. Close enough, at least. He lays his chin on two hands and sighs somewhat blissfully. Knowing that Izuku was alright, willing to be friends with the person who suggested jumping from a roof in the first place. It did things to him. The blonde rears away from the windowsill a tad and flops down on his bed. He bounces slightly from the sudden landing, but soon he's lying still again. He feels bubbly inside and the feeling normally wouldn't be welcomed, but it's simply the mention of the male that makes it erupt in his stomach. It nips at his sides like tiny ants boring into his skin. It hurts a tad, from what he is unsure of, but makes him feel lightheaded even when the color green is mentioned in passing. Bakugo Katsuki is livid. Why, you may ask? Because he's pining over his friend-turned-target-turned-friend-turned crush. That's why he's livid. I'm so effing screwed, he groans into the silence of his room, draping both of his arms over his face. Been such a piece of shit to him and now I've got a stupid crush? He'd freak out if I even mentioned liking him. He frowns and grips at the comforter a little from his own doubts. It wrinkles immediately under his clenched fists. Completely, royally and utterly screwed. Bakugo curls into himself a bit, feeling both drowsy and a little depressed from allowing his thoughts to drift off like so, and reaches over to his desk to grab at his phone. Once he obtains it, he grumbles at the light temporarily blinding him. He jolts a tad at the time. What the F-? I'm too effing deep in this sheet. He tosses his phone down onto his bed. It bounces and almost slides off the side, and rushes out of the room, but not without grabbing the needed supplies for a shower and smoothing out his clothes. Yes, he managed to mess them up while curling up and thinking about Izuku. Shut up. The time read 8. A raid. Izuku leans over the table and peers down at the game plan strewn across it. X's and circled points cover most of the paper. He purses his lips a little and angles his head to glance up at Shigaraki. Sounds like fun. But how many numas are you going to use to try and detain Hapu Tobu? Rosebud lets out a croaky rumble at the kangaroo hero's name. Her eyelids flutter for a moment as if she's dozing off, before opting on displaying a bored expression. Shigaraki shoos her away when she moves to sniff the paper. She lets out a low grunt. We can't risk utilizing all of them, the hand-covered male thrums eerily. His gloved fingers draw unintelligible shapes into the hardwood surface of the table. But the plan is to use at least 3. Then there will be a balance in the party, defense, offense, tank, and a healer. Rosebud barks. Kurogyri, who hasn't ever moved from his station behind the bar, as he was listening to Shigaraki's plan, shushes her. Izuku reaches over to pat the creature's pelt when she whines. So, let me get this straight. He takes a short swig of the drink he was previously indulging in, You want to raid a place? Shigaraki nods. Emchim. Izuku tips his glass back against his lips and gulps down the remainder of his drink. He narrows his eyes at the bitter aftertaste. Because of a little girl, he finishes. His boss huffs. I just explained myself to you, Midoriya. He takes a hold of his own beverage and downs it in one swig. Izuku is tempted to ask if it's alcohol but decides against it. Just when he's about to talk once more, Nada slinks over, peeking over the table due to her staying on all fours. Her tail drums against the ground. The sound gets Shigaraki's attention. He promptly sputters at the sudden appearance and takes a minute to swallow down his drink. Izuku, handyman, greets Nada. Midoriya spares a glance at her to take note that she's showing no signs of leaving now. Shigaraki grunts in response, coughing a little before he gets his bearings again. Need to put effing bell on you or something, he says. Nada bares her teeth at the suggestion. It goes unannounced. Shigaraki then leans forward and points at the little map. Okay, Midoriya, the little girl that I'm willing to bring 3 Numas with to retrieve is named Gaishihibi. Have you ever heard of that surname? Izuku blinks a few times before slowly shaking his head. Nada snorts in unison with Rosebud at the scowl on their boss face. He slams a hand down and rattles the table. Kurogiri sighs in the background as Shigaraki's cup topples off the side. That kid is the child of 2 infamous villains. Shigaraki practically screeches. Both have been locked away in solitary confinement, leaving their child up for grabs. This is the only chance we'll have to gain a force to be reckoned with. The green-haired boy was not fazed by the screaming. Izuku stares at his empty cup before lifting it a little. The red and pink liquid it housed swishes around the shape engraved into the bottom. Rosebud takes it by the handle and waddles off to refill it. The distant sound of sloshing and hacking implies that the drink was actually just regurgitated from the creature herself. Well, what's her quirk? He questions. Rosebud returns with the drink filled to the brim with the red liquid, and a pig's eye and an earring can be seen floating around in it. Izuku immediately grabs at the handle to gulp down more of it. Dabi and Spinner make noises of disgust from their footstools at the bar, whereas Toga playfully jees before downing a concoction of her own. Kurogiri shakes his head and wipes a clear glass with a handkerchief. Nada licks her talons and picks out a strip of hair from the space between her teeth. She throws it aside, just as Shigaraki calms from his unnecessary tantrum. It's called Medusa, he says slowly, as if Izuku is too incompetent to process words that are spoken too quickly. Izuku scrunches up his face a little at the pettiness, but continues to drink. Shigaraki blinks. When Izuku stops to try and avoid the pig's eye and the earring, he speaks again. She can turn anyone she deems a threat to stone and keep them like that. Izuku sputters and swallows the pig's eye. He coughs for a moment before forcing his throat to relax, thus allowing the organ to slide down his throat with ease. Nada snorts at the action. Okay, wait a second. Izuku coughs once more, soon calming down due to Nada and Rosebud patting his back. He pauses before staring at Shigaraki again. What the actual F-Shiggy? Nada guffaws and Rosebud chortles. Shigaraki cringes a little. Don't call me that. So, did you hear about the last robbery that happened a few days ago? Katsuki shovels an entire slab of meat into his mouth, the slab itself drenched with skis and cupping spicier noodles. He swallows it down greedily and licks his lips clean of the residue. Some of it remained, but Izuku didn't say anything about it. Izuku opts on nipping at the pig snout Nada gifted him. The blonde points at Izuku with his chopsticks as soon as he finishes swallowing another slab. His mouth is just a little damp with ramen residue. It was a grave robbery. Some idiots got arrested for trying to ransack a kid's grave because the parents put a bunch of stuff in their coffin. Bakugu scoffed and slurped up some more of his ramen. F-I-N-G stupid if you ask me. They did it on a crime scene too, so the cops would have F-ed them over anyways. Izuku blinked. Hadn't those idiots been the parents of his recent target, Gaishi? Kurogiri did briefly explain that her parents, whom were villains, got arrested for theft. It was a possibility he considered. Izuku pushed a string of tissue out of the pig's snout and threw it over in Rosebud's direction. Rosebud snapped it out of the air, a low croon blossoming in her chest as she leaned down to gulp it down. He shrugged a little and probed at his meal. "I'd be lying if I said I disagreed with that," he thrummed, plucking another string of tissue and gnawing on it. Katsuki slouched forward a little, legs dangling off the edge of the roof. The two had decided to eat atop the roof rather than sit in the lunchroom. Izuku's friends had taken it lightly, whereas the little self-renowned Baku squad wailed as if Bakugo had told them off for even breathing near him. Understandably, Katsuki got peeved and stomped off before they could actually give pursuit and plague him with questions. They either couldn't follow or just decided that they didn't want to, but the former was far more believable when concerning their personalities. Izuku was happy for that. Katsuki's squad not being present, that is. They were good people, but they were too noisy, and Izuku already thought sourly of Kirishima for his upbeat personality. He always knew the Bunny Nemu was a deadbeat when it came to those who were actually happy with their living conditions, but what did he know? Izuku was still sentient and pumped with adrenaline. "So," hummed Katsuki, catching Izuku's attention, "what did you think?" Izuku pursed his lips and tilted his head. "What do you mean, Kaken?" God, the nickname burnt lazy letters along his tongue and he immediately stifled a grimace that followed the word's escape. Bakugo didn't seem to take notice. "The roof," the blonde grumbled. His eyes remained focused on the horizon. Izuku would have thought he looked pretty in another life, probably. "How do you like the roof?" The green-haired boy took notice of how Katsuki glanced down at Izuku's crossed legs and was actually shivering a little. He assumed it was from the cold air slapping them from all sides, albeit the wind wasn't too vigorous today. Izuku shrugged. "It's nice, I guess. There's a little breeze." Katsuki interrupts him, putting down his meal and turning to glare at the male perched beside him. "The F-, you know what I'm talking about, Izuku." He barks. Izuku blanches for a moment before wincing. Rosebud nudges the side of his face with a dried tongue and he rubs her snout. "That," he mutters. Did Bakugo really need to bring that up now? When he was actually enjoying himself in the other's presence for once. A scowl slips onto Bakugo's face, which was once relaxed and examining the horizon. Izuku thought that was a better look on him than this. "Yeah, that. Did you actually forget about that sheet?" He accuses with a jut of his finger. Rosebud shifts anxiously, but does nothing. Izuku's eye twitches before he wills both of them to narrow at the opposing teen, begging him to try and accuse him of something. The green-haired boy inhales deeply. "Kaken," he starts with a light hiss to the nickname, "you told me to jump off a roof and I did. I honestly don't think I can forget something like that, regardless of the methods used to try and do so." Katsuki pauses. Izuku relishes the small look of regret that becomes prominent in his expression. Katsuki then scoots over towards Izuku, getting a little too close to his personal bubble's edge. "Even if someone brainwashed you?" he questions, his voice dropping a few octaves. The idea disgusts Izuku, and Rosebud croons a low note from his side. Izuku forces himself to look away from the strangely calm red pupils that had been slits only a few seconds ago. Instead, he glares at Bakugo from the corner of his eye and bares his fangs. He scoots away. "I will bite you, Katsuki." The two don't talk for the remainder of the lunch party. When Rosebud chirps and spits out the watch Nada left her with to keep track of time, Izuku rises from his spot, gathers up his items, and turns on his heel. Rosebud remains stationary, watching Bakugo with a pensive look. "Sorry," mutters Katsuki, but Izuku has already pushed open the doors and slid down the stairs soundlessly. Rosebud lets out a garbled sigh, and Katsuki knows the creature heard him. Alas, the animal soon departs as well, dismissing themselves with a low croon that Katsuki thinks is a way of saying goodbye. He didn't even say goodbye, Katsuki's mind hisses sourly. That Dmed monster said goodbye, but he didn't. Katsuki can't find it in him to be upset. Katsuki sits there, alone, for only a little while longer and picks at his cold food, before he wills himself up and follows after the male. The bowl is left at the edge of the roof. A snake grasps onto the rim and tugs it over the edge cautiously, surely keeping it from tipping over as it disappears beneath the hood of the rooftop. Another snags up the used chopsticks and disappears the same way it came. Nothing is left at the edge of the roof, but someone dines upon the cold leftovers gleefully. I hate him, Izuku hisses as soon as he is seated at the bar counter. Mango chews at dog kibble beside him, only moving whenever his foot got too close to her face. I hate him so much. He talks too much and won't let the past stay in the FNG past. We know, Midoriya-kun. You've said it several times. Kurogyri hums passively, but says nothing else when the boy repeats the sentence for the umpteenth time. Mango hisses and headbutts Izuku's knee when he kicks her on accident, almost sending him right out of the seat as she drags her bag of dog food to the backrooms. Nada's already knocked back her 5th glass of whiskey, and she's far from wishing to deal with Izuku's ranting. The ridges above her eyes lower and she's soon glaring at Izuku, who's slouching and looking deep into his glass of regurgitated body fluids. She clicks her tongue. "Do you?" she begins, shoving the glass towards Kurogyri in a silent request for more beer, "or are you simply in a state of denial?" Her voice is ever so slightly slurred, but she's in a position where she looks sober enough to play off being drunk. Perhaps she wasn't drunk, as she had half the tolerance of a typical Numu, but it was her 5th drink that evening. Even Mango, who couldn't speak, would believe that the elder was drunk out of her mind. Not like anyone would know Mango's opinion, of course. Izuku narrows his eyes. He glances up at Nada and scowls. She continues to stare at him, undeterred by his appearance. "I don't remember being up for questions, Nada," he quips. Nada frowns, which is a horrid sight due to her split maw. Spit seeps from the edges of her mouth and she raises a claw to wipe it away. "I don't remember asking you if you hated someone or not, Izuku," she mocks, wringing her claws around the handle of her drink once more. Izuku goes to say something in rebuttal, but is interrupted by another. "This is the only time I'm saying this, but Nada has a point," chirps Dabi from another stool, a glass of an unknown concoction in front of him. "You seem to deny a lot of things," lettuce head. Izuku feels his eye twitch. "Really? Is everyone here against him today?" Stop calling me that, Dabi. What even is there to deny?" Izuku questions. A spike-covered head appears in his peripheral view. "Feelings. You said it yourself. I hate him." A guttural voice chimes in. "I hate you," Izuku blurts without thinking. The newest half-gnome, who Izuku hasn't met yet, as they were brewed up overnight, it seems, puffs out their chest a little. Their orange eyes peered down at his somewhat smaller form almost accusingly. He glances away from them. The Numo clambers into the stool to his right and settled down casually. "See? That's what we call denial. You don't even know who I am." Everyone is truly against him today. Even the spiky one agrees with us. Dabi leans on the counter and takes a swig of his drink. The spiky one furrows their brow and grumbles something that Izuku couldn't comprehend for the life of him. "Hadn't you been so nice as to feed me today, I would have bitten off your hand." A clawed hand is placed on the counter and Izuku has to blink several times to realize that his drink is being gulped down by the scale-covered Numu. However, he says nothing about it, simply allowing them to consume the beverage as he waves Rosebud over. Rosebud nods to the half-Numu before throwing up Izuku's personal beverage into another glass. She then departs without as much as a goodbye. Dabi huffs a little as Izuku sips at the drink, of sorts quietly. Nada merely thrums, obviously not fazed by Izuku's diet as it was similar to her own. The scarred male exhales before getting back to the point. Yeah, but really, do you actually hate this guy?" he questions, crossing his arms and quirking a brow at the younger male. When Izuku stays silent, Nada chokes on a laugh so disturbing that Izuku whines from his corner in the room. Nada waves towards the other Numu dismissively without looking away from Izuku, but it does little to help the fact that Izuku clambers out of the locale to get away from the lingering noise. "Oh, well, that's not Nada's problem." "Izuku, you should really stop doing that," chortles Nada. "Just say that you're wrong and we're right." Izuku furrows his brow and pouts a little, thus causing the half-Numu to sneer and swallow down more of their beverage. The green-haired boy tilts his head a little. "Doing what?" he questions, putting down his drink with a small frown beginning to take over his face. Stop answering questions when you know you're wrong, dumbass. The Numuta speaks once more. Their guttural voice startles Izuku and almost makes him choke on his drink. Namiel. So the creature has a name, Izuku thinks, glaring at Namiel, who has a crude smirk on their face. They shrug and push an empty cup towards Kurogiri, obviously asking for another drink. Izuku wonders how long it'll take them to notice that the drink only comes from Rosebud, as Kurogiri refused to bottle such a substance. Someone had to effing say it. They grunt as Kurogiri pours vodka into their glass. Rather than ask for a beverage similar to Izuku's, they knock it back in one gulp. Izuku cringes a little at the sight. Can we just not talk about it? He offers, but it's far too late. Nod appears at him with a cheeky look and he already knows this won't be dropped. He's going to be uncomfortable for the rest of the evening, he realizes as Toga swings an arm around his shoulder and starts blabbering about him, hating Katsuki. It was only 10:09 past midnight when Izuku was stirred awake by the loud vibrating of his phone. A text. A chain of them, actually. Surprisingly, they were all from Katsuki based off of what his notifications said. The boy he'd been avoiding to the best of his abilities for the past week or so. The mere name in the contact, Kaken of course, reminded him of that horrid denial talk he and the others had. They still hadn't dropped it, the conversation soon imprinting on the Numis that couldn't even talk. He throws his legs over the side of his futon, rubbing at his eyes to adjust to the brightness of his phone. Whatever this was, it'd better be good. Reluctantly, he decided to look at the texts being sent to him. Izuku presses his lips together and hums. He reckoned Rosebud and Zuku could probably keep Katsuki from dragging him away in the first place, but he didn't really want them to wake up. Especially when the former of the two had been out all night collecting food to store in her body for safekeeping. On the other hand, the latter had been extremely stressed around Nada lately, thus resulting in him having some symptoms of insomnia for the past few days. If Izuku wanted them to be in tip-top shape for the other activities they'd go through, the best he could do now is to let them sleep. So, with a small sigh, he pushes himself from the warmth of his bed and steps over the resting clump of limbs that was Rosebud's body. Izuku then hobbles over Zuku, who was splayed out across the small rug he decided to put in his dorm so his companions could be comfortable. Mango peeks out of the closet, watching the boy open and close the door behind him before returning to the darkness of the small locale. Zeno made a small noise from their perch upon his dresser before everything went quiet once more. Since it was still somewhat dark out, Izuku was having a ball making sure nobody saw him. Slipping in and out of shadows thanks to that one burglar's quirk, Shadow Step, if he remembered correctly, he went unnoticed by anyone who was roaming the halls. Such a shame that burglar didn't use it at night. Maybe he would have stood a chance against Rosebud then. At least he was tasty and made Nada more of an ally than a foe. Still somewhat sluggish from coming back from an outing with Dabi and Twice, he wobbles up the staircase that led to the roof of UA. The scene was oddly familiar to him. Walking up the stairs to get to a roof. Izuku let out a humorless chuckle at the thought. It was somewhat the same, except he was sure Katsuki was waiting up there for him based off the texts being sent to him. It'd be somewhat different, he guessed. But why at 10:09? What could have been so important? Narrowing his eyes at the faint rays of the moon hovering above the nearby trees, Izuku wipes at his eyes wearily. Really, he should have thought this through. It was rather cool outside and he didn't even have half the mind to get a coat or anything. At least he had shoes and never really wore pajamas, but his clothes were still thin regardless. He yawns softly and peers around the roof for any signs of life, but the serenity lasts a few seconds before he's yanked forward and sat down abruptly. The cool feel of stone beneath his thin clothing makes him shiver a bit, although it was nothing compared to the half-frozen water Namiel would spit on him during their training sessions. The familiar figure of Katsuki crouches in front of him. The moon illuminated the outline of his figure, his eyes seemingly shining under the moonlight. Izuku would be ashamed to say that he thought the male looked a little attractive in said setting. Just a little. The familiar voice of his pseudo-mother laughs at him from within his head, the cackles rebounding off the walls of his skull before ending abruptly. He stifles a snarl at the intangible entity and instead focuses on the male before him. "You actually came up here," Katsuki mutters. The warm hand that remained on his shoulder was not wanted, but Izuku allowed it anyways. If what he thought was going to happen was actually happening, he could gladly take advantage of it. Besides, he was perfectly fine with the free warmth that radiated off the blonde. Izuku blinks a few times before nodding a little, hesitant with how to go about this. "You sound surprised," he noted. The hand dropped from his shoulders suddenly, plopping down beside Izuku's feet. It was a sluggish move, reminding Izuku that the blonde typically woke up around had he been up here for 2 hours already? Regardless, he was cold now and he didn't like it much. Katsuki leans back a tad, granting Izuku some space. Izuku frowns, but only due to the heat being farther from him now. "Well, you've been avoiding me for the past week and I thought..." He pauses and purses his lips. His eyes look down for a moment, as if he's having an internal conflict. "Never mind." Izuku chose not to question what Katsuki was previously going to say. If Katsuki wanted to say something, he'd say it later. That's how this game would be played, Izuku decided. "Why did you ask me to come up here, Kaken?" He questioned cautiously, trying to pry an answer out of the male subtly. It seemed to fail from what he could see, for Katsuki becomes tense and averts his gaze from the other. I thought this over better in my head," says Katsuki. Izuku furrows his brow in slight confusion. Perhaps this is going the way he thought it was? "What? I really FING like you, alright? I'm FNG selfish for it, I know, but I like you. I understand completely if you don't like me. Hell, you should hate me." Izuku stiffens a little at the confession. He was right, but it was a somewhat unpleasant surprise that he'd just go about it like this. Should he really take advantage of him? "Kaken." Izuku mutters, his voice barely above a whisper. It was drowned out by Katsuki's somewhat louder speech. "And I wouldn't even blame you. I've been a FNG horrible person to you all this time, and then all of a sudden I just like you." God, he'd need to do something to stop him from ranting like this. Maybe he should take advantage of this opportunity. "Kaken," Izuku says again, voice growing a tad bit louder and far more stern than before. "It does nothing to stop Katsuki. I even told you to jump off the FNG roof." There goes Izuku's patience. "Kaken." Izuku grabs Katsuki by his shoulders, successfully making him quiet down and finally look back at the male. Much to Izuku's surprise, the male slumps as soon as Izuku's hands reach him, seemingly melting under his touch. He's trembling as well and Izuku knows it's not from the cold. The male is perfectly warm beneath his touch, his eyes lacking their usual spunk and being a tad bit more dull. Maybe Izuku should take advantage of this. "You should," purrs his pseudo-mother before she disappears into the depths of his mind once more. "Kaken." "Shut up," says Izuku. He alters his voice to sound softer, more like how it used to be before he was saved by Rosebud, but still reserved. The blonde presses his head into Izuku's chest, thus making the taller male awkwardly hug him. The action seems to calm Katsuki a tad, as he relaxes fully and buries his face deeper into Izuku. Izuku hadn't had this type contact since he last visited his mother, who had accepted his line of work and merely told him to be mindful and the like. No other connections were shared after their last goodbye, and this was oddly familiar to him. As if he actually enjoyed having the angry ball of rage in his arms. Which he didn't. He despises Bakugo Katsuki. But Katsuki starts once more, seemingly in a poor state as of right. His hands clench at Izuku's own shoulders, seemingly seeking something for balance. God, he was a mess right now. A vulnerable mess that Izuku would gladly manipulate and the like, just for his own amusement. Maybe even embrace the vague past where he used to love this boy, who laid broken and trembling in his arms. Izuku hardens his reserve once more. There was no way he'd let this opportunity go to waste. Besides, the League wanted him to be a spy, and you can't be a spy without manipulating some folk. Even if one of them has to be a fake love interest or the like. Izuku pulls Katsuki from his shirt, soon noticing how the male seems to panic every time he moves away from him. It's a sorry sight. But, nothing, Kaken. You didn't even let me get a say in this. Somehow, even while he's a broken mess of what Izuku thought could only be anger, he still tries to deny Izuku. He pulls a face, A pained one mixed with sorrow and regret, if you could read expressions as well as Izuku could, and shakes his head. You know I've been in but to you your entire life. Why would you even consider? Izuku covers Katsuki's mouth with his palm, effectively making the other shut up for once. Katsuki blinks, almost as if he wasn't expecting it, before averting his gaze from the green-haired boy. However, he makes no move to remove his hand. Let me speak, Kaken. Don't talk after I move my hand. It was not a request, but a statement. Izuku left no room for any disagreements or the like, narrowing his eyes at the slightly shorter blonde. He waited until he felt the light movement of a nod to remove his hand. All right. Izuku inhaled quietly before looking at Katsuki's downcast expression. He tapped his chin lightly, thus causing the male to hesitantly peer up at him. Katsuki fiddled with his hands in a nervous manner and Izuku felt some sort of fondness towards him, although he buried the thought almost immediately. Izuku placed a hand on Katsuki's shoulder again, this time in a more gentler manner. I've accepted your new nature. You've been trying to fix our entire friendship and I appreciate your efforts. Izuku paused for a moment. Katsuki was looking up at him with a hopeful expression, having curled in on himself with a small frown and furrowed eyes. He's really doing this. Kaken, I like you too, he stated finally. It was a lie. Yet, Katsuki seemed oblivious to that factor of the statement. Katsuki blanked out, his face relaxing completely. His clenched fists dropped from Izuku's chest and he stared past him. He blinked dumbly. You do. Izuku nodded slowly as he'd done before, amused by the display before him. Holy shit. Oh my FING god. You like me? A bead of sweat slid down the side of Izuku's face, and he lightly pat the male's shoulder. Kaken, calm down. The pats seemed to do absolutely nothing but rouse the beast once more. You effing like me? Katsuki repeated once more, a strangely large smile on his face as he lifted up the taller green-haired boy and practically smothered him in a tight hug. The hug was the least of Izuku's concerns. He was far more concerned about the fact that he not longer was on the ground. Kaken, put me down. So, this is the girl? A man with a canine's face murmurs, peering down at a girl who he held by the collar of her clothes. Said clothes were damp, obviously on the verge of tearing, but he didn't seem to care much. His accomplice shrugged, gnawing on a stick of bread lazily. Seems so, retorted the other, who had a more avian-like face. They scratched at the plumes scarcely growing on their nape. What are we supposed to do with her again? Dunno. Maybe bring her back to the boss. The canine narrowed his eyes as the girl squirmed a little. His tail hung low between his legs as the snakes hissed at him. The tiny girl whined. Let me go. I want to play with my toys. She muttered, eyes lidded as she squirmed about even more. It seemed to aggravate the snakes. The kid's far too calm about this all. OW. Snakes. One of them bit me. Canine Man almost dropped the kid but relished a hold on them as the snakes began to occasionally bite at his wrist. The avian licks their beak clean of breadcrumbs and wipes some from their feathers. They then eye the chaotic two wearily. Why don't you just cut them off? Not like the boss would mind much. They suggest absent-mindedly. The canine furrows his brow before reaching into his pocket and flicking out a pocket knife. The snakes only began to hiss loudly, alerting the kid. Her pupils dilate and she kicks about, now scratching at the hand holding her with slightly sharpened nails. Hey, don't touch my snakes. She practically screeches, hissing and biting savagely at him. The avian watches as the canine gets nicked by her surprisingly serrated teeth, pulling out his dull knife due to the pocket knife falling from the canine's wounded hand. He then advances, placing the knife to one of the snake's exposed throat and listening to the girl snarl. Stupid kid. Watch who you're yelling at. The canine yelled furiously. The clearing of a throat seized their attention. They instantly froze, all looking at the possible source of it. Izuku rounded the alleyway corner, narrowing his eyes at the sight of unknown people in his minor territory. What were they even accomplishing here? Didn't everyone know that most of the missing people's cases took place in this area? For all one knows, they were merely just a couple of dumbass burglars. Rosebud loomed beside him, glowering at the potential threats and letting out her vicious snarls that made the canine seem like a mere pup. Izuku straightened out his messy mask on his villain's attire, examining the unknown intruders cautiously. They had what Shigaraki wanted, and he'd be dead if he inevitably lost the target because of some thunderheads. "I'm sorry to interrupt on such short notice, but what are you doing to that girl?" he questioned rhetorically, his eyes lidded and gaining a dangerous glint to them. The avian took a step back, pointing the knife at the teen and his companion. Since Rosebud looked more similar to a giant hound because of the lack of light and bristled fur, nobody assumed that she was quite horrifying, to say the least. At least they couldn't see her forearms, or when they would have bolted right then and there. The avian scowled and cawed at him. "None of your business, kid." "Scram!" they yelled. The unfortunate girl squirmed about even more, now baring her pearly teeth and snarling viciously at the two. The writhing snakes followed suit. Let me go, she snapped, thrashing about. The avian, torn between watching the witness and keeping the child silent, merely yelled at the kid. It didn't relieve the situation. "Quit squirming around. You effing imp." She lunged forward and clamped her teeth down on the canine's calloused palm, holding steady until he completely wrenched his hand away. Blood painted her mouth and Izuku thrummed, overwhelmingly wanting to taste the same liquid on his tongue. Just not from the abducted child, as that'd be both quite immoral for him and bad since she was the specific target for his side mission. "Oh, the little sheep bit me," yips the canine, who sucked hands to observe the bleeding teeth marks engraved into his padded palm. Izuku watched on quietly, amused by how stupid the duo was. Did someone send out these two idiots to capture a single, yet dangerous girl? Who a bunch of different people were trying to get? If so, that makes 3. He elbows the beast beside him, gaining her attention with ease. He then flashed her a small smile. "Rosebud, wanna play fetch?" Izuku stifled a boisterous laugh of peculiar sorts when the odd creature snorted, which went unheard by the two bumbling idiots interfering with Izuku's side task. He then pointed over at the yelling trio, although the kid was inevitably the primary concern. Rosebud's pinched nostrils flared. "All right, fetch the little girl for me, okay?" Rosebud hastily lunged at the aggressive males, kicking the avian into the cobbled pavement and eagerly snatching the assaulted girl up by the back of her frayed shirt with her padded claws. She bristled when one of them impulsively threw a crooked knife at her, the object sinking into her gaunt shoulder as she barked furiously at the males. The girl, much to Izuku's liking, immediately held onto the ragged fur of the unknown entity and cuddled up to her. "How entertaining," huffed the plaintive voice that lingered about in his dear head. He unanimously agreed with her. The canine panics, scrambling frantically to desperately try and recover his weapon. "Get your mutt away from me." Rosebud snapped his pocket knife in half, ingesting it before baring her 6 decayed teeth at the attacker. Hell. What the hell is that thing? The entity butts him away from her before clambering over his injured body and obediently stopping in front of Izuku. The girl with snakes for hair rubs at Rosebud's pelt, thus causing the creature to thrum softly. "Doggy, you are so fluffy," she hummed out. It was a surprising contrast from how she'd been in her captor's grasp, thrashing and attacking him with no remorse when he attempted to harm her. She was smart, knew when and when not to fight back. "Good girl, Rose. Now, put her down gently." Rosebud plopped the girl down at the green-haired teen's feet, tail wagging at the praise. Said girl rubbed at her eyes before peering up at Izuku curiously. She was inspecting him, and he decided it was her deeming if he was truly any better than the men who tried to cut the snakes from her scalp. The snakes blinked at him. Izuku reached over and rubbed Rosebud's snout gently. "Good girl. Play tag with the mean men, okay?" Rosebud stood still for a moment, pupils dilating for a moment. Izuku then peered behind the wounded beast, minding the writhing bodies of the 2 wounded men slowly come to and frantically try and gather themselves. "Aggressive tag," he corrected, smiling maliciously as the hideous creature immediately turned heel and lunged at the canine. "She's quite the eager one. She enjoys pleasing you, Izuku," spoke the voice once more. He almost couldn't hear it over the sound of the snake's occasional hissing and the screams and howls of pain hailing from one of the men. He safely assumed it was from the canine, as the howling sounded painfully similar to that of a dog. Just another thing to haunt him for the time being. Izuku nodded, taking note of the fact that the child was watching the scene with round eyes. For her age, she truly wasn't bothered by gore. Maybe she'd seen some things. That's why Rose is a good girl, he answered bluntly, albeit quietly. The girl didn't seem to overhear him, but the plaintive voice did. Kanky. Shut up. The avian screeches out in dreadful fear, watching as Rosebud mauled his deceased partner's grizzled head. She bristled and whipped her head towards him, holding a fragment of his hip bone in her jaw. Said butchered bone shatters on the ground as she returns the favor with a shrill screech, scrambling up to her feet and advancing menacingly towards the unknown male. Holy shit! I'm effing outta here, shit. When he attempted to fly off, she clamps her teeth down on his right wing and threw him to the ground. She roared in his face before clamping her teeth down on his arm. The result left him with a damaged and torn arm and a leg that collapsed into itself when Rosebud slammed her tail down on it. The child held onto Izuku's breathed leg as he whistled the creature back over. Good girl. Extra treats for you. Izuku croons, placing both hands on the sides of the creature's face. She thrums happily at the affections, but soon peers down at the child. She nudges them with her nose, only to purr when the snakes probe at her curiously. The girl looks up at Izuku, and he swears he can see the stars in her eyes. Thank you, Mr. Green. Mr. Green. She decides, nodding to herself as if she made a grand conclusion. It's cute. Almost like a little sister of sorts, he presumed. He drops into a crouch in front of her, minding the king cobra perched in the middle of the confusing mess of writhing snakes merely staring him down. Her quirk was fascinating. It's Midoriya. Midoriya Izuku, he corrects softly. The child doesn't seem to mind the minor correction, instead nodding once more and beaming up at him with fanged teeth. Oh, but thank you, Mr. Midoriya. She corrects, seemingly not possessing an actual grasp on honorifics. He doesn't care enough to inform her about them. At least not now, concerning the dead and almost dead body lingering near some dumpsters in front of him. Where are your parents? Izuku asks, trying to make sure he didn't retrieve the undesirable person. There were uncommon cases of people having the same quirk, and he didn't want Rosebud to have consumed her energy on these lowlifes if he was mistaken. Bad people took them away, put them in jail. The girl answered bluntly, tongue darting out of her mouth as she spoke. He naively assumes it's because of her quirk, as snakes commonly handled their tongues to smell. What's your name, kid? She stops awkwardly for a moment to recall. Oh, Gaishi Hibi. I think that's how you say it. Gaishi nods to herself in a careless manner that overly concerns Izuku if she unknowingly has amnesia or the like. How do you not know how to say your own name? He didn't know, but he merely supposed having her on the LOV's side would be good anyhow. Even if she couldn't defend herself much, she knew how to do some damage. Those shiny teeth looked mighty sharp when they pierced through padded skin. All right, Gaishi. Wanna come with me? He asks quaintly, Rosebud shifting to grimly watch the writhing body of the avian as he slowly loses the will to vainly try and drag himself away from the genocidal maniacs. She lets out a guttural noise that sounds almost smug to him. Gaishi perks, her eyes shining as she nods sporadically. Things. Izuku nods to nobody in particular. Rosebud, carry your new dear friend for me. My hands are quite full at the moment. He sternly orders. The entity croaks out an ominous hum and scoops up the kid, who makes herself comfortable immediately in the creature's arms. Somehow, Izuku has a lingering feeling that she got into this unusual situation because she depended on ill people too easily. It sure seemed like that was the case. He merely waves Rosebud off, overly focusing on the two battered bodies hungrily. You two scurry off now. I'll deal with these two here, he hums, and Rosebud bows her deformed head before beginning to clamber up the side of a building. Gaishii doesn't mind the change, holding on to the hideous creature's mane. She then began to hiss out a soft tune to nobody in particular. However, Rosebud seems happy to detect it, clumsily attempting to mimic the noises as she promptly disappears up the gilded roof. Okay. Bye-bye, Mr. Midoriya. Gaishi calls from above, and then the two are gone. She's a lovely kid, isn't she? Izuku says rhetorically, smiling cynically at the avian. Said entity scrunches up their face in profound disgust, spitting out some copper-scented blood at him. It scarcely gets on the edge of his used shoe, only melting into the crimson color of the sneakers. Izuku sneers. You piece of shit. I'll effing ruin you. You stupid effing kid. Barks the bird, resting on his knees due to his evident inability to function his useless arms. Izuku moistens his chapped lips and chortles a tad, undoubtedly finding some sort of twisted humor in the terrible scene before him. But not as gonna enjoy ripping off your foul tongue. When Izuku returns to his student residence in foolish hopes of simply going to sleep, he's somewhat confused to see Katsuki reading something on his futon. Astonishingly, the mail doesn't mention anything about his fluid overload of exclusive All Might merchandise, opting on skimming a well-worn page of his book quietly. Not only that, but Katsuki almost immediately looked up at Izuku with the fondest look he'd ever seen on the aggressive male's expressive face. It was moderately much for him, to say the least. You're back already, Aizu? Katsuki reasonably questioned, carefully sliding a bookmark of practical sorts between the prominent ridge of the published book and fiddling with it, never really closing the book itself. He then shifted about on the futon to make space for the mail, but instantly took said space back up when Izuku continued to be stationary. Izuku hums a little. He subsequently decides to simply dodge the ethical question and ask his own, somewhat curious about the new nickname that was generously bestowed upon him. He walks onward and peers earnestly at the illustrated cover of Katsuki's book. Some fantasy novel that was immensely popular nowadays. What's with the new nickname, Kaken? Already trying to rub stuff in someone's face now that we're dating? Izuku teases, a bit bored from having to tread all the way here after cleaning himself up. Blood was somewhat hard to get out of fabric, believe it or not. Katsuki looks up at him from under his lashes with a small smirk. Would it be bad to say I've wanted to call you that just for that exact reason? Izuku rolls his eyes, leaned away from the mail and placed a hand over his heart. My pride has been severely wounded, he spoke in a flat tone. Katsuki sneers at him, refocusing on his book with a scowl of sorts. Although Izuku remains 100% sure the mail produces a smile on his face. Appreciate the FING joke, you dork. God, I hate you. That's a lie and you recognize it. Katsuki hums as if he was thinking over it. He then shrugs and prods at the bookmark once more. Maybe. Izuku merely rolls his eyes again. All right, Kaken. Whatever you say. He sighed contentedly, the little jokes undoubtedly making him feel a tad bit better, even if this was all pretend in the desired end. Why are you so surprised that I'm back? He carefully questioned, actually curious over his boyfriend's bewilderment. Katsuki promptly returned his bewildered gaze to the mail, skimming yet another page without looking. Well, you habitually take what? A little over an hour to actually come back to the dormitory? It's always because of Rosebud lagging behind, or something. He shrugged, keeping his strangely relaxed gaze on the mail. Izuku takes note of that, mentally reminding himself to try and occupy more time with Katsuki to gain his trust more. Oh yeah. He hums absent-mindedly. I sent her off a few minutes ago. I already took her on her little walk around the block. Katsuki stalls in his turning of another glossy page for a moment. He then smiles somewhat smugly and peers up at his boyfriend once more, arching a brow. Oh really? You walk that thing? He questions. Izuku frowns a little, although he knows the male is pulling his leg. That thing just so happens to be a chaotic mixture of an adorable toddler and a rabid dog, thank you very much. Oh my effing god, Aizu. What? I'm right. I should say it. A toddler? Really? And you say all that shit like it's pleasant. It makes it more endearing. You're a FING idiot, justly says Katsuki. You're the one who's dating me, replies Izuku. Fuff. No. The two stare at each other for at least 10 precious seconds before Bakugo lowers his eyes back down to his book. He then frowns. "Then make yourself useful and get up here before I kick you out," he states. Izuku's jaw goes slack for a second before he recomposes himself. There is no way he's allowing himself get bossed around by someone as emotionally constipated as Katsuki. He instantly throws up his wounded hands. "It's my room, Kaken," he retorts fiercely. Katsuki schemes another page of his book, not even sparing Izuku a careless glance. "I came here first." Izuku frowns and crosses his arms. Were they positively undertaking this? An argument about who maintained custody of Izuku's room? "No, you didn't." "By all means I did. I've been sitting in here ever since you left out." Another page skimmed. Katsuki subsequently gave Izuku that complacent look once more, peering up at him through lidded eyes once more. "That and I was born first," he instantly added. Silence. But if you listen carefully, you could undoubtedly hear Izuku's incredible patience snap. "Okay, listen here, you little urchin. So, get the F off of me." "Apologize, Kaken." "Fine. I genuinely like you." "That's not an sincere apology, but I'll take it." "Forever." "What?" "I'll genuinely like you. Forever." "There, that's your FNG apology. Now get up here or whatever, I don't care." "Okay, Kaken. I'll genuinely like you forever." "Be quiet and let me read." "Okay, Kaken." Katsuki sat up from his sprawled-out position on the bed. His brow creased a bit at the sight of his boyfriend pulling on a jacket. He was leaving for work again. "How long are you gonna be out?" Izuku faltered for a moment. "As long as I usually am, Kaken," he replied. "And you're just gonna leave Rosebud here?" "With you, yes." Wait, I don't know what to effing do with her." "You'll figure something out." "But what if I don't?" "Kaken," Izuku said sternly, leaving no room for an argument. "You will figure something out." Katsuki sulked. "I FNG hate you." "Michim. That's what you said last time." "Bye, play nice you two." Izuku popped open the door and slid out without another word, shutting the door close behind him. His retreating footsteps resounded through the quietness of the room, aside from Rosebud's bread breathing. Izuku shifted in his corner and Katsuki swore he saw a pair of antennas tracing the walls of Izuku's closet. Red orbs met pupilless eyes. Katsuki could feel the creatures staring at him. "God, you're terrifying." He settled back on the mattress, cringing at how loud the spring's squeaking was in comparison to the creatures. Izuku whined faintly at the noise. "Don't think I forgot what you did to me," Katsuki seethed. Rosebud curled her black lips back to reveal gnarly teeth, a thin glaze of saliva coating each bone to keep them from falling out like all the others. It was ugly, her nostrils flaring and the base of her face scrunching up. Yeah, I don't like you either." The creature fixed her face, shifting in place to lay on her back. She stretched, her potbelly evident thanks to her position. Katsuki forced himself to look away. "Look, how about this? You stay the F away from me and I stay the F away from you," he proposed. Rosebud tilted her head, flopping onto her side with a low snort before huffing. She made no move to advance, however. Katsuki considered that a done deal. "Glad we can agree on something." Katsuki didn't know when he fell asleep. All he knew is that something smelt horrible. The blurriness cleared and two tusks hung heavy over his head. Slobber pooled next to his head, thus causing him to recoil and smack his spine against the wall. He winced, his abdomen still hurt from it being broken, not to mention his spine hadn't fully healed. Sure, he didn't need a brace, but the ghost pains and the like were horrid. "And you're violating my personal space. F-. He whined. Rosebud leaned in closer, tusks nearing his eyes. Katsuki lifted his hands and grappled onto the sides of said tusks, baring his teeth. Rosebud snarled. "What, are you trying to F.A. stab me?" He barked, lifting a foot and shoving it at her blindly. Apparently it hit, concerning the small whine that escaped her mouth that made her draw back. "Keep your giant elephant tusks away from me, god damn it." Rosebud whined, hunching over and lapping up the pool of slobber she made. Katsuki cringed, but couldn't help but feel bad. But only because she sounded like a puppy. "Oi, shut up, quit whining. You're gonna make me feel bad," he grunted absent-mindedly. Rosebud faltered before whining louder. He swore she was testing his patience. "No, you sound like a puppy. Shut up." He looked away from the creature, disgusted by her. He heard shuffling before something poked at his back. He whipped around, just about ready to... Katsuki faltered. "Scissors? Am I supposed..." Rosebud stared at him expectantly, a pair of red scissors in her claws. Her 7 digits twitched a little. "You wanted to groom you or something?" She nodded. He sighed, snatching the object from her sharp talons, although he was careful to not cut himself. Rosebud trilled, leaning closer when Katsuki leaned away from her tusks. "If it makes you go away, fine." It only took around 30 minutes to tame the giant clump of nappy fur that was Rosebud's mane. He'd cut it down to a more respectable size, the mane now puffing around her nape and looking similar to the fur upon a jacket's hood. He was pleased with the result. "You happy?" Rosebud made a noise akin to acknowledgement, so he supposed she was also pleased. She lifted her claws onto the bed and Katsuki glared. "Now that I'm looking at you, those claws are way too sharp." He set the scissors aside, not too bothered by the giant pile of fur laying beside the creature. She tilted her head, staring down at her talons before thrummed. Katsuki's glare intensified a tad. "Get me a file or something. I'm cutting those things." Then another 30 minutes passed, 20 of said minutes being spent trying to find something to cut her talons without harming her. Well, harming her too much. Rosebud seemed to be completely unacquainted with the feeling of pain. "Definitely better. Now you won't FING kill someone when you give them those hugs." "Hey." "Almost killed round face." Rosebud whined. Katsuki ran a hand down the side of his face. "Damn it, stupid monstrosity of an animal." His stomach pounded against his torso, thus causing him to jolt a tad. Rosebud crooned in retort to the noise, obviously thinking that Bakugo was trying to mock her or something. She was dumber than he thought prior to this situation. "You hungry?" Rosebud clicked her teeth together. Katsuki took that as a yes. "Alright, don't do that. Let's go, you big beach." Rosebud cawed at being called a beach, but trailed after Katsuki regardless. The two found the kitchen with ease, the blonde already digging through the fridge for leftovers and the like. The Numu stood by his side the entire time. "Izuku said you only eat meat, didn't he?" Katsuki muttered to himself. "You had blood all over you the last time I saw you." Rosebud poked her nose into the fridge, trying to nip at the frozen steak. Katsuki shoved her aside with a single hand, snagging the steak and leaning away from her. "Yeah, meat it is," he uttered, "and leftovers for me." "Bakugo-kun." A giddy voice called Uraraka, who had awoken at the rather loud noise of Rosebud's snarling and yipping. Katsuki shushed her. "Have you seen Midoriya-kun? Me and Ida have been looking around everywhere for him." She piped, managing a cheery smile although she was obviously distressed. He already knew she was asking him because of the fact that people were starting to catch on to his relationship with the boy. Not that he minded, really, for as long as nobody tried to mess it up, he wouldn't give a damn. Katsuki shifted to put the frozen steak in the sink, running cold water along the ice to let it thaw. He shot a glare at Rosebud when she tried to get a bite. Went out to his side job. He has a job. How else does he feed Rosebud and Izuku? Think he just lets them run rampant like a dumbass? Of course not. I know he's responsible. Why is Rosebud here with you? Don't you two, hate each other? There it is, the worldwide known fact that he, Bakugo Katsuki, despises Rosebud. It had to be brought up in every conversation, didn't it? Rhetorical question. No, it didn't, but it always was, one way or another. Hates a FNG strong word, round face. Katsuki began to remove the thawed steak from the sink, plopping it down on a cutting board. He carved out the bone and tossed it aside, glancing over in time to see Rosebud trying to eat it. He tossed the bone into the garbage as soon as he got a hold of it. Uraraka stood in the entryway of the kitchen, frowning with crossed arms. "It's Uraraka, first of all," she started. "Second of all, what do you mean?" She shifted to watch Katsuki work, her cheeks puffed up with air. "You literally use that word in almost every sentence with someone else in it." "It's a strong word that I use," said Katsuki. "Oh my god dash. If that's all, move. I'm hungry and so is this beach." Rosebud yipped up a fit again, thus causing Katsuki to whack her nose with the handle of his knife. She recoiled and went quiet. "Calm your melon, sing." The girl deflated, seeing that the boy wasn't really taking her seriously. Besides, she'd gotten an answer to what she asked. She'd have to go retrieve Ida to keep him from dashing about even more so than usual. She bowed. Have a good evening, Bakugo-kun." Katsuki didn't spare her a glance. Yeah, whatever." "Scram." "Rude." She whined but left without another complaint. Rosebud stretched over his shoulder, attempting to bite at the raw steak with her ugly goblin teeth. Katsuki smacked her nose, but it did little to deter her. At least, the first time he bonked her. The second time was when she drew back, barking at him. "Stop, I'm cutting sheet, Rosebud, I swear to God." The blonde pointed the knife at her, narrowing his eyes. Rosebud gurgled in response, sticking out her tongue and breathing like a hound. Katsuki grimaced. "What, you want to eat this sheet raw?" She barked, bouncing a little as slobber began to gather at the end of her tongue. "Why did I even ask? Alright, sorry. Move out of the way." Katsuki grabbed the steak, staring at the shifting form of the far taller beast before throwing it at her. She caught it with ease, chomping down and pulling it back into her throat with haste. Even with a potbelly, she seemed to be extremely hungry. How did Izuku manage to feed those things? He didn't want to know. Now let me make my food. When Izuku returned, he was quite baffled, to say the least. Laying on his mattress was not only his boyfriend, but also Rosebud. She curled around him, her tail acting as a blanket of sorts by draping itself over his torso. However, Katsuki seemed to have curled into the creature, using her mane as a pillow of sorts. He knew he'd complain about having pastel green strands in his own blonde hair upon awakening. Had he trimmed her mane? It seemed like he did. She wouldn't shed that much. If anything, she'd shed off the entire mane and grow it back after a month or two. Well, his plan worked for the most part. Zuko had left, as he typically did upon Izuku's arrival. Only due to boss orders, Zuko was needed more often than Rosebud due to the latter working alongside Izuku. Mango poked her head out of the closet, a bundle of hoodies cloaking her figure as she chirped out a small greeting. Izuku settled down on the bed and grabbed a pillow, plopping it at the base of Rosebud's tail and laying his head there. Of course, he had already shed his jacket and the like. He didn't want to torture himself. Rosebud had a stronger body heat than a human did, so she was naturally warm. Or hot, some could say. Regardless, a jacket was not needed. So, with that in mind, he allowed himself to drift off, back turned to Katsuki and head propped up on Rosebud's body. Aizawa furrowed his brow. His black pupils gazed over the crowd of students before him. He cracked his fists and sighed. "Alright, you antichrists, let's get down to business." About 75% of the students blanched, people like Izuku and Bakugo being unaffected by such a name. They were used to it, as Bakugo was seen as a villain and Izuku was seen as a dead man walking back then. Did he just call us antichrists? Denki squeaked. Todoroki shrugged, nonchalant as usual. He hadn't been paying much attention anyways. Only the important parts about sparring for a grade or something. Probably. Zero nodded to himself. "It's understandable," he noted. Denki sulked a little. "We're sparring today," Aizawa piped. "And no, you will not be earning extra credit for sparring." Several people, Zero, Denki, Kirishima and Mina, sighed. Aizawa glared at them and they immediately shut their pipes, averting their gaze. The older pro-hero grunted softly and readjusted his slouched position. He still didn't stand up straight, but he was slouching enough to appear more intimidating than usual. And that was saying something. Each spar is a grade. If you do well with what you've been told, you'll get a good grade, he informed. Izuku tilted his head, Rosebud nudging her way to his side and breathing in his right ear. He pat the side of her trimmed neck, some of the smaller hairs still remaining and prickling him a little, and she moved away. Only a little, but at least she wasn't breathing in his ear anymore. However, if you're defenseless and stupid, you already know what grade you'll get. Aizawa continued. The students paled, Denki pouting whilst Kirishima scratched at the nape of his neck semi-sheepishly. The shark-toothed male breathed out a sigh. Well, that's harsh, he uttered. Denki sneered and nodded along with him, as did Siro and Mina. I heard that, Aizawa noted. The trio paled for probably the second or third time before shutting up once more. Izuku rolled his eyes at the three, but said nothing. He didn't need to rupture his nice guy attitude he was putting up. Regardless, you'll all spar today. If you don't spar, then you'll fail. What if we run out of time? Bakugo piped. It actually sounded like a good question, Izuku noted quietly. He was almost proud of the angry male. Almost. Aizawa regarded him with a tired stare. Not a glare, an actual stare. Almost as if he, too, knew that was an honest question and respected it. We won't. That's why you'll fail if you don't go, he answered. Bakugo nodded and went quiet once more, most likely thinking of who he'd spar. Uraraka twirled around to face Izuku. Her smile blinded him temporarily and Rosebud made a small noise of happiness. Some sort of chirp mixed with a small cry, actually. It caused three people to step away tentatively. Aizu, you down to spar? She questioned with a tilt of her head. Rosebud's small noises fell quiet once more. She seemed to notice the tension slowly brewing up from Bakugo's side of the crowd, as he'd probably heard Uraraka. Who's Aizu? Izuku questioned, pursing his lips and chewing at the inside of his cheek. Uraraka's aura never faltered. Not even when Rosebud's usual sounds of happiness that came with her arrival dispersed. God, the Numu was on the offensive side due to the fact that they'd be sparring. It'd be no good to have her attack someone over such a thing. Oh, I heard Bakugo call you that. I thought dash. Only Bakugo, Izuku interrupted. His brows creased and he frowned a little. Only he calls me that. Uraraka sputtered. Ah, sorry about that. I just dash. Rosebud stepped forward once. Only once. Izuku knew she'd attack her if she kept talking. It was a warning. Rosebud She's not a threat to us, he yelled at the creature. She shifted before stepping away from the unsuspecting Uraraka, who merely blinked a few times before beaming once more. She uttered out a swift apology before refocusing on the teacher, who was surprisingly paying close attention to that one specific interaction. Midoriya, keep your quirk in check, he said. His voice was anything but amused, nor was it vibrant. He truly didn't care much for what Rosebud did, it seemed. If anything, he probably wanted absolutely nothing to do with her since she never disappeared when he utilized his quirk on Izuku. There was nothing for him to do. We don't need casualties this early into the school year. That's what made Uraraka pale. Casualties? She uttered. Her voice was significantly smaller than it was before. About time she took notice of the fact that Rosebud would kill her. Even if Uraraka's pats and hugs were the best to the creature. Kirishima shook his head swiftly. God, everyone just needed to pitch in, didn't they? Rosebud wouldn't hurt a fly. He argued, clenching his fists. Aizawa merely blinked at the bickering crowd, seemingly amused by the stupidity radiating from it. Izuku was certainly amused. How stupid are you? Bakugo piped. Several people flinched and Izuku stifled a scoff. It was hard not to, as he'd seen how Bakugo acted with him. Sure, he was a brat, but he was also someone who demanded attention. No, he wasn't paying close attention to his personality. Certainly not. Didn't you see what she did to those robots in the entrance exam? The blonde added, his scowl unwavering. Izuku was surprised that he was paying close attention to Rosebud at the time. The two did seem to have some sort of history or the like together. He truly wondered what happened between them. Maybe he could ask Nada or something. Mina sputtered. She then puffed out her cheeks, pouting. Rosebud wouldn't hurt Uraraka, she said. Izuku blinked as everyone turned to him. Well, everyone interested in the topic, Todoroki and Tokoyami kept to themselves. wishing to mind their own business rather than discuss if Rosebud would kill one of their classmates. A wise decision, really. She'd snap if anyone else decided to put their input on this thing from here on out. He took note of that when she began to grumble garbled sentences. She was culled with a few pats, but it'd always start back up when another spoke. The boy blinked, slowly and quietly, and shrugged. "I have no right to confirm or deny that statement," he replied. "It was the truth. You are so ominous." The sparring ended quickly. Rosebud was sent out against Kirishima and, thankfully, the red-headed male was smart enough to avoid getting chomped. Didn't mean he won. Rosebud was a rapidly regenerating opponent, so it was kinda unfair. Nobody wanted to go against Izuku afterwards, if nobody didn't count Bakugo. The rest of the day went by fast too. Most things went through one ear and out another. Other than good information. All for one, and Shigaraki wanted the good information. But now, he resided in Bakugo's room with Rosebud, the blonde himself, and Zuku. The bunny human Numu was laid out across Bakugo's futon behind Izuku, occasionally muttering something when Bakugo spoke to him. The two seemed to get along well, strangely enough. Zuku always talked about blondes being odd at the very least. They apparently didn't talk about it, seeing as how Bakugo was content with the creature laying on his bed. Bakugo popped Rosebud's nose. He supposedly got annoyed by her trying to pick a fight with his classmates, so he was disciplining her. Physically, because Rosebud never listened long enough without yipping. "Quit being a brat," Rosebud whined and rubbed her nose. Bakugo pointed at her, scowling. "Don't effing you whine at me." Izuku flipped a page of his comic book, studying the form and anatomy of the characters before sketching out a base in his notebook. How else would he know how to draw the people in his class? "If you're trying to DSPLN her, it won't work," he crooned. Zuku shifted behind him, but remained in his position of being used as an armrest. Brains aren't as squishy as you think. They were pretty hard, given the fact that the protection was still in effect. So, unlike the brains he typically dined upon with Nada and Namiel, this one didn't leak fluids when he set a glass of water upon it. The glass held steady. The blonde grumbled. "Well, she's been listening to me enough, oi. Calm the F down." Rosebud began to yip once more, rising back onto her haunches and looming over the red-eyed male. She then continued to yip, although it was primarily pointed at him rather than some unknown entity she seemed to be aware of. Zuku merely said that she saw ghosts and sheet. Izuku took his word for it. Another page flipped. "She's doing it because it annoys you." He hummed, sparing a glance at the scene. Bakugo had his hands on his hips, now glaring at Izuku. He held his gaze for a moment before looking back at the Numu, who grew silent again. "Oh really? Is that what you're doing here?" he asked, and Izuku knew he was talking to the brain-dead creature. He sneered. Bakugo frowned. "She says you're lying," he said, pointing at Izuku. Rosebud wailed in agreement. Izuku felt his eye twitch. "See?" The green-haired boy dragged a hand down the side of his face. He had no time for this. "Kaken, stop with the pet talk. If you think this is the first time this has happened, are wrong. Nope. You're a liar." Rosebud said so. Bakugo insisted. Rosebud curled back her lips and chortled, a haughty noise that was also borderline cynical. Well, borderline cynical to anyone other than Bakugo, Zuku, and Izuku. Hell, Uraraka stopped trying to give Rosebud pets and hugs after the Aizu incident. Bakugo and Kirishima, who was surprisingly bold, were the ones to spoil her now. Mostly Kirishima. Izuku set down his book to blink slowly at the duo. "She can't even talk." Rosebud stretched herself to look taller. That could only mean one thing. Waved a she Rosebud no dash too late. Rosebud, being the brain-dead, petty creature she was, decided to wail. Rather than a normal one, it was loud. "I told you she could if any talk." Bakugo yelled over her wailing. "She's screaming at me, not talking." Rosebud wailed louder at his choice of words. "Damn it." Izuku lifted up his hands to cover one ear so he'd be able to at least hear Bakugo's retorts. "Hey shit, that's loud." "We don't curse in this motherfucking room, Aizu," Bakugo replied. Why was he unaffected by the screaming? Probably because he went deaf from his own quirk or something. It was a lingering possibility that Izuku would address later. He has to get Rosebud to stop screeching, or else someone's gonna come into the dorm and see that they're actually violating the rules. He did not need to be suspended or sent to Principal Nizu. That rat thing was terrifying. You're contradicting yourself. Izuku retorted. Demon right I am. Rosebud's wailing ceased after a moment, but she did make a sound akin to that of agreement. Izuku curled up his comic book and threw it at her, twitching when she merely sidestepped it and loomed beside the blonde. Izuku grumbled, stirred a little in his sleep, then returned to his still posture. Lucky BSRD. Stop encouraging his behavior, Rosebud.